Every Christmas night the world sings about Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. But what happens when the famous nose is tired, the sky is crowded with deliveries, and Santa has turned into the grumpiest manager at the top of the world? Tonight we whisper the true history of a very exhausted Rudolph, a very demanding Santa, and how even a legend has to learn to say no. Chapter 1. The Reindeer Who Worked Too Many Christmases. The morning briefing began before the sun even considered showing up. Of course, at the North Pole in deep winter, the sun almost never showed up, which made it a very dedicated employee from Santa's perspective and a very bad influence from Rudolph's. If the sun could get away with not clocking in, why was everyone else expected to sparkle on command? Rudolph stood near the back of the main workshop hall, hooves resting in grooves worn into the old wooden floor by centuries of reindeer and elves. His breath rose in pale clouds. The air smelled of pine resin, hot cocoa, and the faint metallic scent of toy trains. Above him, strings of soft golden lights hummed quietly. They tried very hard to be festive at 5 in the morning. Rudolph admired the effort, even if his eyes were not reddened. At the front of the hall, Santa cleared his throat with the gravity of someone about to announce an international treaty. In reality, he was about to complain about delivery routes. "All right, team," he began. There were no quotation marks floating over his head, but everyone heard them. Santa did that thing where his voice became 3 sizes grander than necessary. The elves in the first row straightened their backs. The reindeer shifted in their harnesses on the demonstration platform. Somewhere near the side door, a pot of cocoa boiled with anxious enthusiasm. Rudolph watched, calm and a little amused, as Santa unfurled a huge map of the world. It stretched from one wall almost to the other. New routes glowed with faint magical light. There seemed to be more of those glowing threads every year, like someone had spilled stardust over the planet and then assigned him the job of cleaning it up before morning. Santa pointed at the northern hemisphere, which was entirely covered in tiny glimmering dots. "We have record wish lists this season," he announced. Again. Rudolph listened politely. He had heard the phrase record wish lists so many times that it sounded like a seasonal weather report. Somewhere in the wings, an elf assistant shuffled parchment, papers, and something that looked suspiciously like a spreadsheet printed in festive red and green ink. Santa moved to the Atlantic. "We must optimize our route over Europe," he said, as if he had discovered a fresh insight. That was where he always wanted to optimize. He talked about prevailing winds over the North Sea, about dense cities, about how much faster they had to be over London and Paris and Berlin. He mentioned Scandinavia with a nod, as though apologizing to the cold forests for rushing through them. Rudolph's nose gave a faint, polite glow. It knew when it was supposed to participate in meetings. He had flown over those cities for longer than most of their buildings had been standing. He knew the wind patterns that wrapped around tall towers and over old rooftops. He knew which chimneys were stubborn, which rooftops were slippery, and which balconies accumulated dangerous garden gnomes. He also knew that no amount of optimization could add more hours to the night. Magic was impressive, but strangely uninterested in overtime regulations. Up near the front, Comet tried to look alert and successful. Dasher shifted his weight from hoof to hoof, ready to sprint even while standing still. Vixen yawned once, quietly, behind the curve of another reindeer's neck. The sleigh bell that hung over the center of the room chimed once without permission, as if it also wanted to say that this was all a bit much. Santa continued, voice warming as he talked about efficiency, route clustering, and on-time delivery rates. Somewhere in his mind he was still the jolly wanderer of winter tales. In practice, he sounded more and more like the manager of the busiest logistics company on Earth. Rudolph watched him with complicated affection. He knew Santa was worried. He also knew that worry, combined with centuries of habit, tended to harden into grumpiness. The elves would do their best, the reindeer would give everything they had, and at the end of the night Santa would still find dead more way to say that next year they needed to do just a little better. An over-caffeinated elf beside Rudolph scribbled notes. She had 3 pencils tucked behind done ear and a 4th in her hand. Her eyes shone with dedication and a slightly alarming amount of cocoa sugar. "We are also calibrating nose brightness thresholds," Santa said, turning at last toward the reindeer, "especially for our lead." A soft ripple passed through the hall. It always did when he said that word, lead. Somewhere in the world people were telling stories about Rudolph with songs and lights and cartoon specials. Here, lead meant extra paperwork and the privilege of being blamed first when clouds decided to cooperate with gravity. Rudolph inclined his head a little, politely. Santa gave him a nod that was meant to be warm and landed somewhere closer to you. "You know I am counting on you, right?" The meeting wound on. Santa spoke about new safety checks. He mentioned rest periods which sounded encouraging, until Wars realized that his definition of rest involved sitting still for 5 minutes while elves measured wind speed. The elves asked questions. Charts were held up. Some of the younger reindeer tried to look like they understood magical fuel efficiency curves. Rudolph, who understood them very well after so many seasons, let his attention drift for a moment. Through the windows high on the wall he could see the pale sky shifting from deep navy to something only slightly less dark. The aurora murmured faintly, a soft green curtain in the distance. A quiet part of him longed to be outside in that stillness instead of inside listening to another promise that this year they would be more efficient than ever. Santa concluded with something that almost sounded like encouragement. The team applauded out of habit, hooves tapping, little hands clapping, bells jingling. Another season officially begun. Rudolph sighed softly and followed the others out into the cold. The pre-flight routine awaited him like an old script. Outside, the air was clear and sharp, the kind of cold that made every breath feel like drinking clean water. The sleigh stood on its rails near the edge of the main yard. Its red paint was polished to a gentle shine, not as glossy as the pictures on greeting cards, but steadier. The harnesses hung from their posts, leather softened by countless winters, metal rings polished by the touch of hooves and careful elf hands. Rudolph approached his station at the front. The snow crunched under his hooves with the precise sound of a well-rehearsed arrival. An elf technician stepped up, scarf wrapped twice around his neck, eyes calm and professional in the way of someone who cared deeply about checklists. "Morning, Rudolph," the elf said. Rudolph dipped his head in greeting. The words were not needed. They had done this together for many years. The elf unfolded a clipboard. It was enchanted to resist snowflakes and cocoa spills, which made it the most advanced piece of equipment in the yard as far as Rudolph was concerned. "Hoof condition," the elf read. "Left 4. Rudolph lifted his leg. The elf examined the hoof, checked for cracks or ice, gave a satisfied nod and moved on. They repeated the process for each hoof. Muscles were pressed, joints gently flexed, a few encouraging pats delivered. Rudolph tolerated it all with quiet patience, feeling every familiar ache and every old strain along the way. "You are holding up well," the elf murmured as he noted his findings, "especially considering your service record." Rudolph's nose gave a tiny skeptical glow. Holding up well sounded like the sort of thing doctors said, when they had also underlined a few worries in their private notes. Next came nose brightness calibration. The elf took out a small device, a sort of magical lantern with frosted glass. He adjusted a dial until the light inside shone at a particular softness. "All right," he said, "give me a gentle glow." Rudolph focused on the center of his forehead, where magic and biology had long ago shaken hands and agreed to make his life more complicated. A warm rise of light moved into his nose. It glowed softly, like a lantern wrapped in red silk. The device hummed, measuring. The elf checked the reading. "Perfect," he said. "That is your base level." Rudolph thought calmly that base level was a generous phrase for something that had once been called miraculous. Time had a way of turning miracles into default settings. "Now a strong shine," the elf said. Rudolph increased the glow. Light spilled across the snow in a red arc, brushing the sleigh runners and the elf's boots. The world around them took on the quiet color of a winter evening in a city where neon signs hide behind snowfall. The device hummed more loudly. The elf adjusted a dial. "We do not want you at full brightness for too long this year," he said. "It is effective, of course, but the strain readings from last season were quite something." Rudolph let the glow fade. He knew the strain readings from last season by heart. Hours of pinpoint focus, cutting through blizzards and smoke and city clouds, guiding a sleigh across a world that had decided to build taller buildings and launch more lights into the sky, just to make his job interesting. The elf completed his notes. Then came the paperwork. Magical insurance declarations, route acknowledgements, safety confirmations. Rudolph watched the quill move over parchment and thought about how, in the early days, they had simply looked at the sky, shrugged at the weather, and trusted their instincts. Progress, he supposed, had many pages. Later, as the day leaned toward its slow Arctic twilight, Rudolph stood beside the sleigh with an older elf named Mikkel. Mikkel had been around long enough to remember when Santa's workshop had operated without a single printed schedule. His beard was almost as white as Santa's, but he wore it shorter, as if to insist on being practical about the whole aging thing. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while. The sleigh cast a long shadow across the snow. From the workshops came the muffled rhythm of hammers, the whir of toy trains being tested, the small but determined cheerfulness of elves singing work songs in slightly off-key harmony. "Busy day already," Mikkel said at last. Rudolph gave a soft snort that was almost a laugh. "Santa is in a mood," Mikkel added. Rudolph tilted his head as if to ask when that had not been the case. Mikkel smiled, pale eyes crinkling. "It gets to him," the elf said. "The numbers, the expectations, the world asking for more every year. He forgets that everyone else is getting tired too." Rudolph let his gaze wander over the yard. Reindeer moved between stables and harness posts. Elves pushed sleds loaded with wrapped parcels. A small group of younger reindeer practiced takeoff in the distance, hooves thudding softly on packed snow. Every movement spoke of experience, of routine, of a machine that had been running for longer than some countries had existed. "He is not as jolly these days," Mikkel said, "but he is still trying, in his own grumpy way." Rudolph considered that. Santa had once been a warm, booming presence, more laughter than beards. Now he carried the weight of graphs and statistics, of letters from children who knew far more about the world than their ancestors. The magic of surprise had shrunk in the age of constant information. The demands, on the other hand, had grown. Rudolph felt a gentle ache behind his eyes, the kind that came from centuries of glow and strain. He wondered how many more seasons he could carry the weight of secret expectations without saying anything. Mikkel followed his gaze. "You have been at the front for a very long time," he said. "That glow of yours is special. But special should not mean endless." Rudolph's nose flickered once like a tired star. "If you ever need to talk," Mikkel added, "you know where the slow cocoa is." Slow cocoa was the kind boiled over a quiet stove in the small kitchen behind the stable, away from the bustling main halls. It was thick, gently spiced, and usually accompanied by a silence that let thoughts catch up. Rudolph inclined his head, grateful. The conversation ended they, as many of the best ones did, without grand statements or neat resolutions. As evening drew itself around the North Pole like a heavy blue coat, Rudolph walked alone to the far edge of the compound. Beyond the last lantern post, the snow stretched out in soft, unbroken waves. The sky above was a deep velvet, scattered with stars that seemed both near and far at once. The aurora rippled faintly, pale green and purple curtains shifting across the darkness. The world away from the workshop noise felt spacious, almost weightless. Rudolph lifted his head and let his eyes rest on the horizon. The cold nipped at his nose. For a moment he kept it unlit, enjoying the quiet anonymity of being just another shape in the snow. He thought of the first time he had flown for Santa, of the excitement that had hummed in his bones. He thought of the legendary foggy night that had turned his red nose into a symbol sung by children in places he would never visit on foot. He thought of how each miracle had silently signed him up for more, until the world seemed to believe that he could keep shining forever without growing weary. Behind him, the faint jingle of harness rings drifted on the breeze. Ahead of him, the sky arched wide and indifferent, an ancient ceiling over for very tired reindeer. A single point of red light bloomed at the end of his nose, small and steady. It painted a circle on the snow at his feet, not wide enough to guide a sleigh, just enough to keep him company. Another season was beginning. The lists were longer, the routes more complicated, Santa a little more demanding than last year. Rudolph felt the familiar mix of duty and reluctance settle over his shoulders like a worn but necessary blanket. He drew in a long breath of icy air and let it out slowly, watching it unfurl in front of him like a temporary cloud. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet thought turned over. He remembered the days before the legends, before the songs, before the meetings about efficiency. He remembered being simply a reindeer in the snow, with a slightly odd nose and a wide-open sky. For the first time in a very long while, he allowed himself to wonder if that part of himself still existed somewhere beneath the schedules and expectations. The sky above him remained silent. The aurora shifted lazily, unconcerned with delivery targets. Rudolph stood there until the cold wrapped all the way around his bones. Then he turned back toward the lights of the workshop, his red glow leading the way through the dark yard. Another winter, another run, another season of being the light everyone relied on. He walked back to the stables with slow, measured steps, carrying not only the harness he would wear, but also the weight of the days when it had all begun. Chapter 2. Once Upon a Quieter Winter. Long before the endless checklists and glowing maps, before the songs and the cartoons and the breathless retellings of one foggy night, there was a valley where winter moved at its own unhurried pace. It lay somewhere in the far north, beyond the last human village, beyond the last marked road. Snow rested thick on rolling hills and tall spruce trees. A narrow river ran through the valley, dark and quiet, steaming faintly in the deep cold. The wind there did not hurry. It travelled at the speed of old stories and patient creatures. In that valley Rudolph was born. Back then he was just another small reindeer, brown and wobbly-legged, with a nose that caused mild concern among older relatives and mild amusement among younger ones. It glowed, yes, but not with the radiant certainty it would later achieve. In those early days it was more like a shy lantern, flickering when he sneezed or when he became excited. When Rudolph was very young, the glow embarrassed him. Other calves could disappear into the dusk when they wanted to skip bedtime. He could not. His nose announced him like a lantern carried by a child who had been told very clearly to come inside. On long winter evenings the herd gathered in the sheltered part of the valley, where the wind was kinder. The adults stood in a loose ring, heads lowered, breath mingling in the air. The calves huddled together in the middle, trading stories and occasional gentle shoves. Rudolph listened as the older reindeer told tales about past winters. They spoke of migrating herds, of frozen lakes that sang when the ice shifted, of wolves that the adults described with a respectful distance. They talked about humans too, the ones who moved through nearby lands, building small settlements with smoking chimneys and glimmering windows. The humans were a distant fact back then, like the stars, interesting to look at, nothing to do with him. Every so often an adult would glance down at Rudolph's nose and offer some practical advice. Try to dim it, they would suggest kindly. Just a little. It makes you easy to spot. Rudolph would concentrate, scrunching his forehead, attempting to pull the light inward. Sometimes it worked for a moment, reducing his nose to a faint pink. Then a friend would whisper something funny and the glow would flare back in a bright burst of laughter. It was not dangerous exactly. The valley was remote, and the predators that occasionally prowled its edges were more interested in slower, weaker animals than in an energetic calf who could sprint uphill when startled. Still, the glow made him feel different, a little too visible in a world that valued blending in with snow and shadow. One particularly clear night, when the stars lay thick across the sky like spilled salt, Rudolph stood at the crest of a small hill. The snow beneath his hooves was packed and glittering. The air was so still he could hear the river murmuring softly below. His nose was shining more than usual. The cold seemed to coax the light out of him. It painted a gentle red circle on the snow, outlining his small hooves. He wished, very quietly, that he could trade the glow for something simpler. Faster legs, maybe, or antlers that grew earlier. Something that would make sense to the herd. Instead, he had his odd little lantern of a nose and the sense that the world paid more attention to him than he wanted. Far away, human lights shimmered faintly on the horizon. Small cabins in Lapland, smoke rising in straight lines. He did not know their names, just that they existed. To him they were tiny, temporary stars on the ground. Time moved in seasons. Spring brought thin grass and melting snow. Summer brought long pale days when the sun hardly bothered to set at all. Autumn brought crisp winds and the soft cracker of frost under hoof. Winter wrapped everything in deep white silence again. Rudolph grew, his legs lengthened, his shoulders widened, his antlers began to branch with quiet pride. His nose kept glowing. The herd adjusted. They stopped trying to fix it, and simply learned to stand on the side of him that did not shine into their eyes. When they migrated, he learned to walk slightly to the back at night, letting the adults lead. His glow lit the path for the younger calves, which they secretly enjoyed. Still, there were nights when he crawled into a drift of snow and wished he looked like everyone else. One year, near the start of true winter, a strange whisper moved through the valley. It came not from the wind, but from the birds, from passing foxes, from reindeer who had wandered further north and then come back. There is a place, they said, where the snow never fully melts. A workshop at the top of the world, a sleigh, a man in red who flies. The adults rolled their eyes at such stories. Flights were for birds, they said. Reindeer walked. That was the proper order of things. Rudolph, however, listened with careful attention. The image of a flying sleigh lodged in his mind like a spark caught in dry moss. He wondered what kind of reindeer would be chosen for such a task. Fast ones, surely, strong ones, brave ones who would not blink at storm clouds. He did not think of himself. The winter deepened, snow piled high against the tree trunks. The river narrowed and slowed, its song muffled by ice. The herd settled into its familiar routine. Then, one evening, the sky over the valley changed. At first it looked like an ordinary aurora, pale green ribbons unfolding across the darkness. The herd did not bother to look up. Aurora were beautiful and distracting, but they did not bring food or warmth. Then the green shifted to a deeper blue. Threads of gold appeared, shimmering like sunlight trapped in water. And from somewhere beyond the northern ridge came a sound very few reindeer had heard before. The soft jingle of harness bells. The adults lifted their heads. Rudolph's nose flared without his choosing. The red glow reflected off the snow, making him suddenly the brightest thing in the valley. His heart hammered against his ribs. Over the ridge, silhouetted against the swirling sky, a sleigh appeared. It moved smoothly, not quite flying yet, gliding at a height that seemed impossible but undeniably real. 8 reindeer pulled it, hooves touching snow only now and then. At the reins stood a figure in deep red, fur-lined coat flapping gently. The sleigh's runners whispered over the drifts, leaving barely a mark. The herd stared. The sleigh slid down the slope toward the valley floor and came to a graceful stop among them. The harness bells chimed once, twice, then settled. The 8 reindeer at the front breathed in unison, steady and strong. The man in red stepped down. He was shorter than Rudolph had imagined, but broader, as if built from the same sturdy wood as old sleighs. His beard was thick and white, his eyes bright and sharp behind round spectacles. His coat was red, yes, but more wine-coloured than the bright scarlet found on later greeting cards. It looked warm and practical, as though he actually used it in weather rather than for show. He greeted the herd with an easy nod, as if he visited valleys like this every day. "Good evening," he said, voice carrying gently across the snow. The led doe of the herd stepped forward, cautious but not afraid. She sniffed the cold air around him. There was no scent of fear there, only cedar, cinnamon, and a hint of fireplace smoke. "We do not usually host sleighs," she said calmly. The man smiled. Under the beard he looked tired in the way of someone who had spent many years pretending not to be. But there was a spark in his gaze, a twinkle that made his whole face gentler. "I have heard of your valley," he replied, "and of a young reindeer who shines." Rudolph tried to sink behind a snowdrift. His nose, traitorous as ever, flared brighter in his panic. The herd turned as then. Dozens of eyes landed on him. He felt his ears heat in the cold. The man followed their gaze and saw the small red glow peeking out from behind the others. His expression shifted, softening with genuine interest. "There you are," he said. The adults parted just enough for Rudolph to step forward, which meant they gently nudged him until he did. He moved carefully, aware of every crunch of snow. Up close, the man in red smelled like long journeys, pine forests, and distant chimneys. When he looked at Rudolph's nose, he did not wince or frown. He simply studied it, as some might study a lantern made by an unfamiliar craftsman. "That is quite a gift," he said. Rudolph flinched at the word gift. For most of his life it had felt more like a label that said "this side up" in bright letters. The man crushed some snow between gloved fingers, thinking. "I am Santa Claus," he said, as if that explained everything. For many in the herd it did not. A few of the older reindeer had heard the name in passing, carried on the wind from human stories told around fires. A figure who brought presents, a legend that moved like shadows between snowflakes. But legends were slippery things. Seeing N in the middle of the valley was disorienting. Santa considered Rudolph with measuring kindness. "I travel the world each winter night," he said. "I bring gifts to human children. I already have a fine team, as you can see." He gestured toward the 8 reindeer at his sleigh. They stood proud and composed, hooves planted like experienced soldiers. Rudolph saw muscle under their winter coats, saw the calm readiness in their eyes. "We fly through storms and darkness," Santa continued. "Some nights the clouds try very hard to hide every star. Some towns lie buried in snow and fog. I have heard whispers of a reindeer whose nose shines in the night." The herd shifted, impressed and suspicious at the same time. There was something flattering about being the subject of whispers that travelled all the way to the top of the world. Rudolph's shoulders tensed. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. "I am looking," Santa said lightly, "for a special helper. Not for every night, not for every journey, just for those times when we need a little extra light, a reindeer who can guide us through the worst of it." His tone was casual, almost offhand, the kind of tone that suggested this would be a small favour, a side project, nothing that would change a life. Rudolph considered his valley. The familiar trees, the slow river, the comfortable routines. He considered the stories he had heard about human settlements, about chimneys and rooftops and streets lined with lights. He thought about the sky, wide and empty above them. He imagined moving through it without hooves ever touching the ground. He also imagined how it would feel to be useful in a way that made sense of his odd glow. The led doe looked at him. "It is your choice," her eyes said, "but remember that some offers do not come twice." Rudolph swallowed softly, his nose warmed, shining brighter in the gathering dusk. What would it be like, he asked himself, to see the world from above, to follow the curve of rivers across continents, to watch cities sleep and wake? Santa watched him carefully. He did not press. That, perhaps, was his greatest skill in that moment. He simply waited, letting the silence fill with possibility. Rudolph felt the weight of attention settle onto his shoulders. For once, it did not feel entirely heavy. There was something else mixed in. Hope, maybe. Curiosity. Santa smiled. "Just on special nights," he said, "when the weather is difficult, when the stars are shy. We could use your help then." Nothing too exhausting, nothing too exhausting. The phrase slipped through Rudolph's ears and settled somewhere deep inside him. It sounded reasonable. It sounded manageable. It sounded like a promise that would surely stay small. He looked at the valley one more time, at the snowbanks where he had hidden as a calf, at the trees that had watched him grow, at the river that whispered of distant seas. Then he took a step forward. The herd murmured softly, some in concern, some in awe, some simply in acceptance. The world changed in small ways more often than in dramatic ones. A calf, agreeing to help a winter traveller, seemed like a small thing. Santa's eyes warmed. "Good," he said quietly. "I think we can do something remarkable together." Rudolph approached the sleigh. The 8 reindeer studied him with varying degrees of skepticism and amused interest. "First time," one of them murmured. "You will be fine." The harness they fitted him with felt strange at first, a web of leather and bells resting across his shoulders. Santa checked the straps himself, nodding in approval. The air near the sleigh vibrated faintly with magic, like the hum of distant bees. Rudolph's heart raced. His nose glowed brighter, lighting the snow in front of the team. "Just special nights," Santa repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. "Just when we need you." The sleigh moved forward, pulling against the earth. Hooves pounded the snow. The bells sang. At first they were simply gliding, fast but familiar. Then the ground below began to blur. Rudolph felt it in his chest before he saw it. A soft lifting, a lightness in his legs, the sudden realization that there was no longer the comforting resistance of snow under hoof. They were flying. The valley dropped away, trees became dark brushstrokes against white. The river narrowed into a thin line of ink. The herd below looked up as the sleigh rose, their shapes small but steady. Rudolph's nose blazed, not from effort but from exhilaration. His light cut a path through the early evening air, reflecting off stray ice crystals. Wind rushed past his ears, cold and clean and alive with possibility. Below them the land unrolled like a map. Snow-covered hills gave way to forests, then to small human settlements. Rudolph caught glimpses of chimneys, of smoke curling up into the sky, of lamps glowing in windows. He felt a strange tenderness for those tiny lights. They reminded him of himself, trying to hold back the dark a little circle at a time. The training flight that night was not long. Santa guided them in a wide loop over the land, testing Rudolph's ability to hold a steady glow, to adjust his brightness as the weather shifted. There was a patch of fog near a distant lake. His red nose sliced through it like a warm promise. When they finally turned back toward the valley, Rudolph's muscles ached pleasantly. His lungs burned in a way that felt good rather than frightening. He understood in that moment why birds never looked bored. They descended in a controlled glide, landing near the place they had taken off. The herd watched, silent and thoughtful. Santa patted Rudolph's neck with a gloved hand. "Well done," he said. "You have a talent, my friend." Rudolph tried to pretend his heart was not swelling dangerously close to his throat. "Remember," Santa added, "this is not every night. Just when the sky misbehaves. You will still have your valley, your herd. This is simply an extra adventure now and then, an extra adventure. A side job. Nothing too exhausting." The words settled around Rudolph like snowflakes. Light, innocent, destined to pile up over time. He watched the sleigh depart, carrying Santa and his seasoned team back toward the distant north. The bells faded into the night. The aurora folded itself away, tired after its performance. Back in the shelter of the valley, the herd pressed around him. They asked quiet question. How did it feel? Was the wind very strong? Did the world look different from up there? Rudolph answered as best he could, searching for words big enough to hold the sky. That night he lay in the snow, nose dimmed to a soft pulse, staring up at the stars. They seemed closer now, not because he had flown very high, but because he had tasted the possibility of reaching for them. Somewhere beyond the northern horizon, Santa's workshop waited. A place where snow never fully melted, where reindeer pulled sleighs through the air, where a man in red measured nights with lists and chimneys rather than hours. Rudolph felt excitement buzzing under his skin. He also felt, very faintly, the first thread of a future obligation settling over him. It was delicate, almost weightless, easy to ignore. He closed his eyes, listening to the slow breathing of the herd around him. He did not know yet that Wen's special job would grow into many, that Wen's promise of nothing too exhausting would stretch over centuries, that the glow he wished away as a calf would become both his greatest pride and his deepest fatigue. For now, he was simply a young reindeer in a quiet winter valley, with snow under his hooves and the memory of flight in his bones. The sky held its breath above him, as if waiting for the rest of the story to unfold. Chapter 3: The Famous Foggy Night and What Came After. For a long time the story was told very simply. Once, on a foggy Christmas Eve, Santa had almost called the whole thing off. Then a young reindeer with a glowing red nose stepped forward, saved the night, and became a legend. Children repeated this version in warm houses, faces bright with excitement. Adults nodded, pleased with the neatness of it all. Rudolph remembered it differently. The night had not begun as a legend, it had begun as a headache. He had been with Santa's team for some years by then. Not centuries, not yet, but long enough for the valley of his childhood to feel like a distant, quiet dream. The North Pole was his home now. The workshop, the stables, the endless lists, the snow-packed runway where the sleigh gathered speed and then left the earth behind. These were his everyday life. That particular Christmas Eve, the sky had looked stubborn from early afternoon. Clouds stacked themselves over the horizon like someone piling blankets over a lantern. The air felt damp and heavy. Even the elves grew quiet as evening approached, watching the horizon with lines of worry between their brows. Inside the main hall, the final loading of the sleigh took place with the usual frantic care. Parcels slid into place, guided by magic and muscle. The lists were checked, then checked again. Santa moved among the elves like a captain on a ship about to face rough seas. His smile was thinner than usual, his eyes flicking often to the windows. Rudolph stood harnessed at the front of the reindeer team. He could taste the weather in the air. The fog was not here yet, but it was coming. It had that heavy, waiting feeling, like a curtain about to drop over the stage. Santa joined them at the sleigh, cloak already damp at the edges from the rising mist. He told the team that there might be some difficulty over certain regions. He did it in his confident voice, the one meant to calm everyone else. The reindeer nodded. They had faced snowstorms, icy crosswinds, and sudden blizzards. This would just be another night with a few complicated patches, surely. Rudolph tried to believe that. His nose prickled faintly, a strange sensation deep in the glow. It felt like the world asking him quietly if he was ready. They took off into a sky that was still only grey. At first the flight felt ordinary, in the way that pulling a sleigh full of presents across huge stretches of air can ever feel ordinary. The familiar rush of wind, the comforting weight of the harness, the distant twinkling of stars. Below them the North Pole shrank to a cluster of lights. The world opened up, dark and waiting. They made good time over the first regions. Northern forests, scattered villages, lines of pale roads. Rudolph guided them between drifting clouds, his nose a gentle beacon. Then they reached the edge of a weather front that had been quietly making its own plans. The fog rose from the earth like steam, thick and fast, swallowing landmarks and moonlight alike. It was not the soft, graceful mist that looks good in stories. It was the heavy, stubborn kind that clung to everything and refused to let go. One moment Rudolph could see a line of rooftops below. The next, there was only a grey wall. Santa pulled on the reins, bringing the team to a slower, more careful pace. He peered into the murk, spectacles gathering tiny droplets. He muttered something about visibility and timing. The reindeer's ears flicked back. When Santa muttered, it usually meant that schedules were about to suffer. They pressed on for a while, relying on memory and instinct. The team knew the general direction of each region, the rough shape of the world beneath them, but chimneys did not announce themselves through solid fog. Rudolph's glow brightened naturally, sensing the need. The red light cut into the grey, creating a small tunnel of visibility ahead. It helped, but not enough. The fog swallowed the edges of his light, turning everything into a soft blur. They missed a few chimneys. Santa circled back where he could, but each extra loop ate precious time. The night did not grow longer out of sympathy. Eventually they reached a point where even Santa had to admit the truth. They could not continue like that, feeling their way through fog while the hours slipped past. He called a brief halt high above a stretch of countryside that might have been fields or might have been a very determined cloud pretending to be fields. The sleigh hovered, the reindeer beating their hooves in place, steam rising from their bodies. Santa looked ahead, then down at his maps, then ahead again. The maps were useless in a sky made of cotton. For a moment Rudolph saw something rarely visible in Santa's expression: doubt. The songs later would not mention this part. They would not describe the way Santa's shoulders sagged beneath his red coat, or how his gloved hands tightened on the reins. They would not tell how his gaze moved from the fog to his team and back, weighing impossible choices. He spoke into the grey air, voice low. He wondered aloud if they would have to turn back. He spoke of how many children might wake to empty trees, of how the weather had finally outplayed the magic. There were no trumpets in that moment, only the soft jingle of restless bells, the sound of reindeer breathing, and the distant hush of the wind. Rudolph felt something shift in his chest. The idea of turning back without finishing the work felt wrong on a level deeper than logic. He thought of small houses and quiet apartments, of children who had written letters with hope pressed into every line. He thought of how the world already felt heavy and unsure in so many ways. If there was one thing that should remain steady, it was surely the simple promise that on this night, someone would try their very best to show up. He moved a step forward at the front of the team. Santa looked at him, red light reflecting in his spectacles. Rudolph did not have grand speeches. He did not declare that he would save Christmas. That was not his style, either then or later. What he did have was a nose that refused to dim, and a stubborn unwillingness to accept defeat quietly. He lifted his head, focusing on the glow. He did not think of half-strength or base levels. He thought of doorsteps, of stockings, of the valley where he had once wished his brightness would go away. His nose flared. The light that poured out was stronger than any he had produced before. It cut through the fog with a fierceness that surprised even him. The grey thinned in front of them, pushed back by the warm red beam. Shapes emerged, trees, rooftops, chimneys. The world reappeared, carved out of mist by his determination. For a long heartbeat Noah spoke. Then Santa straightened in the sleigh, some of his old spark returning. He told the team that they were continuing. He instructed them to trust the red glow, to follow Rudolph's lead more closely than ever. He spoke with renewed certainty, as though the doubt had never been there. The night became a test of endurance. Rudolph held his glow at that heightened level for hours. Every chimney they reached felt like proof that he could keep going, proof that they had made the right choice. The other reindeer adjusted their formation around him, taking their cues from the way his light angled and shifted. They flew over town after town, city after city. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. Snow fell through the fog, visible only when it passed through the red beam. It looked like a river of sparks. By the time they finished, Rudolph's whole body trembled from the effort. His nose ached deep into his skull. He barely noticed the last stretch back to the North Pole, his mind numb with exhaustion. They landed at dawn, the sky fading to pale grey over the horizon. The elves cheered the moment the sleigh touched down. Word had already spread through the workshop that the fog had almost stopped the night and that the red nose had cut through it. Santa stepped from the sleigh like a man returning from a battle that would never be described quite accurately. His beard was damp, his coat askew, his spectacles smudged. He looked at Rudolph with something that went beyond gratitude. Admiration, dependence, relief. The songs would later reduce that look to a single line about calling out his name and guiding the sleigh. The reality contained more weight. Rudolph barely heard the cheering. His legs felt like snow. Elves surrounded him, patting his flank, praising his bravery. Someone tried to offer him cocoa, but his stomach was not on speaking terms with the rest of him. He made it to the stable with help from one of the older reindeer. There, finally, he let himself collapse onto a bed of straw. His nose dimmed to the faintest of glows, a tiny ember instead of a flame. The legend was born that night. It just took the world a little time to hear about it. In the early years that followed, the story travelled slowly. Word of mouth, mostly. A tale told by parents who had heard it from travellers. A rumour that moved along trade routes, growing softer around the edges with each retelling. Then came radio. At some point in the 20th century, humans began putting music and stories into the air itself. Songs floated over cities, bounced off mountains, slipped in through open windows. Someone wrote a cheerful little tune about a reindeer with a shiny nose. Singers lent it warm, friendly voices. Orchestras wrapped it in strings and bells. Rudolph heard it by accident one year. They were flying over a small town in North America, passing close to a house where someone had left a radio playing near an open window. The melody drifted up through the cold air. For a moment he thought he was imagining things. The lyrics were unmistakable. He almost dropped a parcel. Later he would grow used to hearing his own name sung by choirs and crooners, but that first time, it felt like the sky itself was telling him a story about his own life, except with rounder edges and fewer headaches. The song was kind, as stories go. It made him sound noble and heroic, which he did not mind. It mentioned how the other reindeer had once mocked him, which they found amusing when he told them later. They remembered the teasing, but not quite in the dramatic way the song described. Artistic license, they said, shaking their antlers with wry amusement. The part that unsettled him was not the exaggeration. It was the way the story ended with that famous foggy night, as though his life had neatly wrapped up the moment he stepped into the role of saviour and never had to do anything difficult again. In reality, that night had been the beginning of a new phase, one where his nose was no longer a useful oddity but a brand. Santa did not become a marketing expert overnight. He stumbled into it slowly, as most people do when the world starts paying attention. At first, there were just more requests. A town council somewhere wrote to the North Pole, asking if the real Rudolph could perhaps appear at their Christmas event. Santa frowned at the logistics, then agreed to send him along one year on a smaller sleigh, accompanied by a trusted elf. The crowd went wild. Children waved signs they had drawn in shaky crayon. A local band played the song almost in tune. After that, the invitations multiplied. Cities wanted Rudolph to lead their parades. Shops wanted him to pose near their decorated windows. Charities wanted him to draw attention to their winter drives. The world had discovered that glowing noses were very good at drawing eyes. The elves built smaller sleighs just for appearances. The reindeer team began working odd extra days throughout the season, flying not to deliver presents but simply to be seen. Santa tried to organize it fairly at first. He rotated the reindeer through different events so that no would work too many. But, as one very pointed letter from a regional committee in Europe made clear, some groups wanted specifically the famous red nose. Rudolph attended many of those in the early decades. He learned to stand on platforms above crowded streets in New York City, while marching bands played and confetti fluttered down like artificial snow. He posed near department store windows in London, where elaborate displays of toys glittered under electric lights. He stood at the edge of open-air markets in small German towns, warm red glow reflecting off stalls piled with spiced cookies and wooden ornaments. Humans loved him. They reached out small hands, eyes wide. They asked if he truly had guided the sleigh that one foggy night. He learned to nod in a way that acknowledged the myth without trying to list all the missed chimneys it did not mention. Santa watched all this with a mixture of pride and calculation. He saw how much joy the appearances brought. He also saw how they strengthened the belief that kept his magic strong. The more people sang about Rudolph, the more they believed in the whole story. Belief, as it turned out, was a respectable fuel source. There was only one small oversight. No one remembered to ask the red-nosed reindeer how many extra nights he could give before the shine began to wear thin. At first Rudolph did not mind. He liked seeing the world up close. He liked watching cities decorate themselves in lights and garlands. He liked the taste of roasted chestnuts drifting up from street vendors, the sound of carolers in narrow lanes, the excitement buzzing under the cold air. He told himself this was just a busy period, that things would settle back into a simpler pattern, that the world rarely settles down once it discovers a new favourite thing. One year, as he stood on a small parade float in a Scandinavian town, he looked up at the sky. Snowflakes fell gently through the streetlights. Above them, beyond the glow, the old familiar stars waited. He felt a tiny pang for the nights when it had been just him, the team, and the steady curve of the earth below. No cameras, no crowds, no event schedules. Only work, yes, but a certain quiet kind of work. He did not resent the children staring at him with shining eyes. He simply began to realize that there was a difference between being needed and being used, and that line was starting to blur. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of his own song from a distant radio. Rudolph stood tall on the float, nose glowing dutifully. He smiled in his reindeer way, calm and kind. Somewhere deep inside, a small tired thought stirred. This had all started with one foggy night and a promise that it would not be too exhausting. Chapter 4. World Tours, Bright Lights, and Shrinking Patience. There is a particular kind of light that only cities can make. It is not the clean, distant glow of stars or the shifting silk of northern lights. It is a restless brightness, made of street lamps and billboards and windows and 1,000 glowing rectangles held up by human hands. It spills up into the sky and lingers there like a hazy dome. Rudolph knew that light very well by the time the tours began. What had started as a few special appearances slowly turned into a regular feature of the season. The first snow had hardly settled on the North Pole before elves began pinning up posters on workshop notice boards that listed travel dates and events. Parade in New York City, tree lighting in London, charity flight over Paris. A promotional stop at a large shopping centre whose name sounded less magical and slightly over-caffeinated. Santa insisted there was still only one true Christmas Eve, the night of the real deliveries. Everything else, he said, was merely outreach, kindness, connection. The calendars, however, told a more demanding story. On many nights in early December, Rudolph found himself harnessed to the sleigh not for the familiar global route but for shorter hops between major cities. Sometimes they flew in low and quiet, landing on rooftops out of sight. Other times they made grand, theatrical arrivals, gliding down over crowds as bells rang and announcers introduced them with excited voices. The first time they descended between tall buildings in Manhattan, Rudolph almost forgot to breathe. The air smelled like exhaust and roasted nuts and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Light spilled from windows stacked high into the sky. Steam rose from vents in the street. Cars slid along in narrow lines, their headlights glowing like small determined comets. As they passed above Times Square, Rudolph saw every color the human world could think of reflected on glass and rain-slick pavement. Billboards shouted in bright images. Neon signs drew hard outlines against the night. It was dazzling, impressive, and absolutely exhausting. Santa seemed fascinated. He drank it in with wide eyes, beard lifting slightly in the city wind. Humans are really embracing the season, he murmured more than once, as if the flashing advertisements were simply enthusiastic carolers with better lighting. Rudolph did not mind the enthusiasm. What he minded was that, even high above it all, he felt smaller and more tired than he ever had under simple stars. London was a different kind of bright. The old streets twisted around themselves like coils of history. Strings of lights crossed above them, soft and golden. The air smelled of wet stone, roasted chestnuts, and distant pubs where people laughed to keep the damp away. The sleigh touched down one year in a hidden courtyard near Covent Garden. Elves hustled Rudolph through a service entrance and into a grand plaza, where a massive tree towered over the crowd. Cameras were already rolling. A host with a polished smile introduced Santa and the famous red-nosed reindeer. The audience cheered. Some waved small flags. A choir sang a slightly too upbeat version of his song. Rudolph stood near the base of the tree as Santa gave a short speech about joy and generosity. He nodded at the right moments. His nose glowed just brightly enough for the cameras to pick up. When the ceremony was over, they scarcely had time for a breath in a quiet alley before they were hustled back to the sleigh and into the air, heading to the next engagement. Paris brought its own style of glow, warm and golden along the Seine, concentrated in a steel tower that pierced the sky like a needle of light. Berlin flickered with a mixture of old-world markets and new-world neon. Small Scandinavian towns shimmered delicately under snow, their lights gentler but no less demanding in their own way. Through it all, Rudolph flew. He learned to land in hidden courtyards behind shopping centres, guided by elves who had memorized service entrances and freight corridors. He discovered that most large buildings shared a secret world behind their public faces, a maze of quiet hallways, staircases that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, storage rooms stacked with boxes. In these back rooms, he and the reindeer team often waited for their next cue, surrounded by shopping carts, spare decorations, and the hum of distant air conditioning. He found those moments oddly soothing. While the front of a store exploded in music and light, the backrooms were still. Employees moved through them with tired efficiency, carrying boxes, checking lists. They greeted Rudolph with a kind of muted wonder that was less theatrical and somehow more sincere than what he saw out on the stages. Somewhere near the loading docks, there was almost always a small gathering of staff on break. Security guards, cashiers, stock workers. They sipped coffee from paper cups, warming their hands. When Rudolph passed by, noses twitching curiously, they smiled in surprise. They asked simple questions. How cold is it up there? Is the sleigh heavy? Does Santa ever get airsick? Rudolph answered in his quiet way, with gentle nods and expressive ears. The elves translated where necessary, turning his looks and snorts into sentences. Laughter followed, soft but real. In those small hidden conversations, he felt a shared weariness that crossed species. They were all working through long nights under bright artificial light, trying to keep some version of magic alive for others. But no matter how gentle the backstage moments felt, the schedule did not care. One evening, after a tree lighting event in a huge shopping mall somewhere in North America, Rudolph found himself standing alone for a few minutes near a quiet exit. Through the glass doors he could see a parking lot stretching away under sodium lamps, cars sliding in and out in an endless loop. Behind him, the mall hummed with sound, music, announcements, the murmur of tired shoppers. Somewhere nearby, a Santa actor in a rented suit was posing for photos with children, beside a fake sleigh and a plastic reindeer painted a flattering shade of red. Rudolph watched the scene with calm disbelief. Even here, where the real sleigh had just landed on the roof, humans had created their own smaller version. It was oddly touching, in a way that also felt slightly absurd. He noticed the actor's weary eyes behind the beard. The man smiled for each child, laughed on cue, jiggled a prop bell. When the line paused, he shifted in his seat and stretched his shoulders, joints popping. Rudolph felt a quiet kinship. They were both working under someone else's idea of holiday magic, trying to stay cheerful under hot lights. The age of shopping malls did something strange to time. In the valley of his childhood, seasons moved with the weather. At the North Pole, they moved with the lists. Out here in the world of commerce, the season seemed to begin as soon as the last traces of summer vanished. Decorations appeared earlier each year. Carols echoed through speaker systems before the first snow had fallen in many places. By the time true winter arrived, everyone in those glittering halls looked as though they had already worked 3 holidays in a row. Rudolph noticed the way some parents clutched bags with tired hands, the way their smiles for their children grew thinner at the edges as the evening dragged on. He saw employees standing near displays in stiff uniforms, eyes drifting toward the clock just often enough to give themselves away. He wondered, in his quiet way, when exactly the celebration had turned into a marathon. Back at the North Pole, Santa kept insisting that all of this helped. He spoke in staff briefings about the importance of visibility, of connecting with people where they were. He pointed to charts that showed belief levels holding steady despite changes in the world. The elves nodded dutifully. Many of them enjoyed the challenge of coordinating complex events. Rudolph watched from his place at the back of the hall, feeling a gentle crack appear in his patience. He did not begrudge Santa his concern. The world was changing quickly. Children now grew up with screens in their hands, information flowing into their minds at astonishing speed. The old stories had to compete with countless other stories. Santa was right to adapt. But somewhere between the first charming city parade and the 5th shopping center tour in a week, the balance had shifted. The work no longer felt like an occasional extension of their persons. It felt like the main event, with the supposedly magical night squeezed between press appearances. One evening, after an especially long day of flights between cities, Rudolph returned to the North Pole stables long after midnight. Snow swirled in the dim light of the yard lanterns. The other reindeer stumbled to their stalls with the heavy steps of creatures who had used up every spare bit of energy. Rudolph shook snow from his coat and eased out of the harness with a wince. The leather had rubbed raw spots where it had not before. An elf offered to check his shoulders. He waved him off gently, not trusting himself to be polite for much longer. He stepped outside again for a moment, seeking the open sky. The stars were faint, blurred by thin cloud, but they were there. The aurora hung low, a slow-moving river of pale green. Compared to the city lights he had just left, the scene was almost dark. He found the darkness soothing. It did not shout, it did not blink out advertising slogans. It simply existed, ancient and unbothered by schedules. In that quiet his resentment finally admitted itself. It did not arrive as a storm, it came instead like a small persistent ache. A sense that the work had grown beyond what any of them had signed up for. That Santa, in his understandable worry, had started treating them as resources rather than companions. The realization sat in his chest, uncomfortable but also clarifying. He thought of the valley again, of nights when the only lights were stars and the occasional cabin window, of the first training flights when the world below had been mostly dark, dotted with pockets of human warmth, of the promise that this would be a special job now and then, nothing too draining. He stood there until his breath stopped steaming, until the cold crept into his bones. Then he turned back toward the stable. Inside, the air was warm with hay and the soft sounds of sleeping reindeer. Bells hung neatly along the walls, harnesses rested on pegs, quiet and obedient. He settled into his stool, folding his legs under him with a sigh that he did not mean to be quite so loud. From the next stool over, Blitzen spoke softly. "Long night." Rudolph flicked an ear in agreement. Blitzen went on. "I remember when we used to have time to nap between events," he said. "Now it feels like we just land and they already have the next parade lined up." There was no real anger in his voice, only bemused fatigue. Comet muttered something from further down the row about the strange tug of crosswinds between skyscrapers. Donna brought up the unusually slippery balcony they had landed on in one particular city. They swapped small complaints, turning them into a kind of lullaby. Rudolph listened, then added his own thought. He mentioned how the city lights made it hard to see the stars, how his nose had to work harder against all that brightness, how the sky sometimes felt crowded, filled with signals and beams and reflections. The others were quiet for a moment. Dasher said that he had not thought of it that way, but now, yes, he also felt it, the weight of artificial light pressing up from below. Vixen mused that perhaps this was why everyone seemed more tired. The job had not only become longer, it had become noisier, in ways they were not built for. They drifted into silence after that, each wrapped in private thoughts. Far away in some city whose name he could not remember at that hour, a fake reindeer still stood in a mall display, frozen in a permanent festive pose. Rudolph imagined it, painted and unblinking, and felt an odd wry tenderness. At least that never had to attend meetings. The next morning Santa held another briefing. He praised the success of the city events. He mentioned letters arriving from mayors and organizers. He read out notes from children who had seen Rudolph in person for the first time. The words were sweet and sincere. Then he brought up efficiency. He talked about refining schedules so they could fit in even more appearances without overstraining anyone, which was a nice thought in theory. He used phrases like route consolidation and maximizing magical throughput. An elf presented a chart showing that they were only using a certain percentage of their pre-Christmas evenings. Rudolph stared at the chart and thought, with calm sarcasm, that percentages could be very misleading when they forgot to count invisible things like fatigue. He caught Mikkel the older elf watching him from the side of the room. Their gazes met briefly. Mikkel raised an eyebrow in a way that said, "Yes, I see this too." Then the moment passed. The season rolled on. More cities, more tree lightings, more back rooms with coffee machines humming in the corner, more cameras aimed at his face while his nose glowed dutifully. He did his job. He kept flying. He kept smiling in the quiet reindeer way. But somewhere inside, the patience that had carried him through so many winters began, gently and almost politely, to shrink. There would come a night when that patience finally stepped forward and asked for something in return. For now the world turned under him in bright circles. The stars watched from their quiet distance, and Rudolph, the reindeer who had once just wanted to understand his odd nose, found himself at the center of a holiday machine he had never meant to power alone. Chapter 5: The Age of Online Lists and Impossible Routes. The first time the elves installed a glowing screen in the main workshop hall, Rudolph had a feeling the world was about to become harder to deliver. It started with a single display mounted on the far wall. At first it only showed simple things, weather maps, general routes, a polite amount of information, the sort of tool that seemed helpful. Then the internet finished doing what the internet always does. The display began to fill with numbers, wish counts, order tallies, regional breakdowns, lines and graphs and curves that climbed in a way that made even the hardiest elf swallow nervously. As more regions came online and more wish lists went digital, the screen updated faster, the lines climbed steeper, the calm blue of the map gained blinking icons, each representing some new delivery challenge. Rudolph stood at the back of the hall during the first official briefing with the upgraded system. Santa faced the screen, arms folded, spectacles shining with reflected data. An elf in a neatly pressed vest operated a pointer, explaining how real-time wishlist integration made planning more efficient. More efficient, Rudolph thought, was a phrase that rarely translated to less work for anyone with hooves. The elf tapped a section of the map. Here were the requests from Europe, updated every few minutes as children added items with a few taps on devices. Here were the requests from North America, pulsing gently in several different time zones. Asia was lit like a festival. Even the quiet corners of the world now sent in their wishes with shocking accuracy. Santa stroked his beard, face thoughtful and slightly troubled. He said that when letters arrived by post there had been a kind of built-in delay, a natural slowness. By the time a letter reached the North Pole, there was a limit to how many times a list could change. Now, he said, softly grumpy, a child could decide they wanted a different toy an hour before midnight, and somehow that information still found its way to the screen. Elves nodded, fingers flying over small devices that hummed with magic and something suspiciously similar to electricity. Rudolph listened to the explanation. Online lists, digital wish portals, integrated naughty and nice databases, everything tidily organized and constantly updated. His calm, sarcastic mind translated all of that into a simpler sentence. The world now expects us to be everywhere at once, and it will be very loud about it if we are not. There was no going back. The letters still arrived, of course. Some children still sat at kitchen tables and wrote with careful hands on paper that smelled faintly of crayons. Those letters held a special place in Santa's office. He read them with particular care, smoothing the wrinkles with his fingers. But around those paper treasures, a storm of digital requests swirled day and night. In the stables, the reindeer began to notice the change in the air even before the snow deepened. Night flights lengthened, routes grew more tangled. No matter how cleverly the elves arranged the plan, the simple fact remained. More wishes, spread out across more places, all expected to arrive within the same impossibly short window of time. Magic could bend distance. It could soften time around the edges. It could not, however, make the reindeer bodies forget that they had pulled a heavily loaded sleigh across half the planet in what felt like one continuous breath. On some nights, Rudolph felt the hours stretch like thin ice. They would launch from the North Pole into the familiar dark, the sleigh climbing quickly over the frozen sea. The first leg still felt comforting. Cold air, stars overhead, the clean rush of wind. Then the updates from the workshop began to reach Santa's pocket device, a new list uploaded. A region with unexpected extra requests, a weather pattern shifting over the Atlantic that forced a last-minute detour. Santa adjusted their course with muttered calculations. The reindeer leaned into the harness, hooves striking the air harder. Europe arrived earlier than it used to, not because the continents had moved, but because their schedule demanded it. Dense cities greeted them with their usual glow. They skimmed over rooftops, landing on narrow ledges, slipping into the tiny gaps between tall buildings and the sky. There was no longer much room for the old gentle rhythm of the night. Deliveries that had once felt like a steady marathon began to feel like an obstacle course being timed. Rudolph did not complain out loud. He was not much of a speech maker. But in the quiet of his thoughts, he noticed how his body needed more time to recover after each run. The ache in his shoulders lingered longer. The familiar pleasant burn in his muscles began to feel sharper, less noble, and more simply painful. His nose, too, felt the strain. The constant switching between full brightness in stormy patches and softer glows in city lights left a pulsing tension behind his eyes. Some mornings he woke with his head thick and heavy, light still humming under his skin as if it had not quite turned itself off. The elves, to their credit, started tracking this in tidy ledgers: nose strain readings, flight duration, rest periods between major routes. They tried to ensure that no individual reindeer was overworked. The problem was that digital wish lists did not respect tidy ledgers. Requests surged at odd hours. Weather fronts formed out of nowhere. Human traditions multiplied. Suddenly there were more pre-Christmas events than any chart had been designed to handle. Each change tugged at the whole carefully arranged plan. In response, Santa introduced something he called check-in meetings. Rudolph privately referred to them as evaluations with extra cocoa. They took place in a smaller room off the main halls. There was a table, some chairs sized for elves, and an oversized armchair for Santa. A warm lamp cast a gentle glow over everything. On the wall, a more modest screen displayed statistics for the night's routes. Reindeer took turns being called in for a chat. Rudolph sat through his first official performance review with a sort of fascinated disbelief. Santa spoke in a tone that tried very hard to be casual. He mentioned that Rudolph's navigation accuracy remained exceptional. He praised his ability to adjust light levels quickly in changing conditions. Then he hesitated, looking at a chart that showed route times. He observed that in certain regions they were falling behind. Nothing dramatic, just a few minutes here and there. But those few minutes multiplied across the night. Santa asked how Rudolph was feeling. It sounded like a kind question. It also sounded like a question whose answer was supposed to be fine. Rudolph responded honestly, within polite boundaries. He mentioned that the new schedules left little room for small pauses in the sky. He noted that the combination of longer routes and more pre-Christmas events meant that his rest period felt thinner each year. Santa nodded slowly. He tapped the chart with one gloved finger. He explained that the world had changed, that expectations were higher, that they had to be smarter, faster, more organized, that he believed in the team, especially in Rudolph, to meet these new challenges. Rudolph listened, feeling his tail twitch with restrained sarcasm. He did not disagree that the world had changed. He simply thought that noticing change should also inspire a question about limits. After the meeting, Santa made a small note in his planner. More hot mash for the reindeer. Extra blanket rotation in the stable. Perhaps a short additional rest day between some events. These gestures were not meaningless. The reindeer appreciated the softer hay and the slightly longer midday naps. But the essential shape of the season did not bend. The lists kept growing. The routes kept lengthening. The meetings added one more obligation to days already full of obligations. It was not some dramatic moment that pushed Rudolph toward burnout. It was a collection of small, steady weights. The chill that never quite left his bones even after a long sleep. The way his nose sometimes flickered unexpectedly when he was tired, as though uncertain whether it wanted to participate. The subtle change in his own thoughts. He found himself dreading certain announcements. When elves cheerfully reported that new regions were now fully online, he felt his heart sink instead of lift. When Santa spoke about expanding their outreach, Rudolph imagined yet another tree-lighting ceremony in a city he would never really see from ground level. One early morning, after a particularly demanding run through bad weather over several continents, Rudolph stood alone in the yard while the others went inside. The snow was quiet under a sky that had not yet decided whether to grow light or remain dark. His breath rose in slow clouds, his nose glowed faintly, less a beacon and more a tired nightlight. He thought about the valley again. There winter had once been something he lived inside. Snow on his back, cold in his lungs, stars overhead. Here at the North Pole in this new age, Winter felt more like a tunnel he had to race through to reach the other side before dawn. He was not angry in the way storm clouds are angry. His nature leaned toward gentler weather, but he was tired in a way that no nap could fully erase. He realized, with a calm sort of surprise, that the joy he once felt at the first jingle of harness bells had been replaced by a quiet heaviness. This was the edge of burnout. Not a dramatic collapse in the snow, but a slow dimming of enthusiasm. He could still do the work. He would still do the work. But something in him had begun to quietly ask why no one was admitting that the work had changed so much. He stood there until Mikkel appeared, leaving a trail of small footprints across the snow. The older elf did not launch into a speech. He simply stepped up beside Rudolph and stood in silence for a while, hands tucked into his coat. After some time, he observed that the new screen in the hall was very impressive. He also observed that it did not show how much a reindeer's legs burned halfway through the night. Rudolph let his nose glow a little brighter in agreement. Mikkel patted his shoulder. "We will find a way to balance this," his eyes seemed to say, even if his mouth did not make the promise out loud. Rudolph wanted to believe that. He also knew that balance rarely arrived on its own. It usually had to be dragged into the room by someone who had finally decided that enough was enough. At that moment, he was not yet ready to be that someone, but he was getting closer. Chapter 6. Small Rebellions in a Very Snowy Workplace. The first hint that something might finally shift came on a morning that seemed entirely ordinary. The sky hung low over the North Pole, a soft lid of cloud. Snow drifted down in small, half-hearted flakes. Elves bustled about, their boots squeaking faintly on packed snow. The sleigh stood ready near the runway, harnesses lined up like well-trained soldiers. Rudolph woke with a familiar ache behind his eyes. The previous week had been a blur of flights, meetings, and a very long global route squeezed between several smaller events. His nose felt oddly heavy, as if the light inside had decided to sit down and refuse to budge. He shook his head and tried to summon the usual warm glow. Nothing happened. The panic was instant and thoroughly awake. He focused harder, breathing deep, calling up the magic that had never failed him. A dim red shimmer appeared, flickered once, then faded again. It was like trying to light a lantern with damp matches. For a moment he truly believed that it had finally happened, that his nose had simply decided after so many seasons that it was retiring without notice. He stood in his stall, heart pounding, nose stubbornly dull. Then, under the worry, another thought slipped in. What if this was not failure? What if, just for a brief moment, it could be a statement? The idea arrived almost shyly, like a small elf knocking on a very serious door. But once it was inside, it began to rearrange the furniture. Rudolph realized he had a choice. He could tell the elves that his nose seemed to be malfunctioning. They would rush around him with measuring devices, mutter about magical flux, perhaps postpone a flight or two until they found a cure. Or he could walk out into the yard with his nose set to the faintest of glows and claim very calmly that he was having what might call a technical issue, a small rebellion wrapped in concern for safety. He considered how tired he was. He considered how many times he had pushed himself beyond that point simply because everyone assumed he would. He decided that, just this once, he would not force the light to full strength. The yard felt strangely bright without his usual red beam. The lanterns along the stable wall seemed louder. Snow reflected their white light instead of his familiar crimson. An elf technician approached with a clipboard and a prepared smiled. He greeted Rudolph, then paused, eyes drifting to the notably unremarkable nose. Rudolph held still, expression calm and steady. The elf blinked. "Is your glow dialed down?" he asked, a little uncertain. Rudolph gave a short, measured snort and shook his head once. The elf frowned and raised the clipboard, scanning down a list. He took out a small instrument, waved it near Rudolph's nose, and squinted at the reading. "That is odd," he murmured. "Output is significantly reduced." Any discomfort, Rudolph allowed himself the smallest of tired nods. The elf's face softened at once. He scribbled on the clipboard and hurried away, already calling for a more senior technician. Within minutes, a small cluster of elves surrounded Rudolph, discussing magical conductivity and energy reserves. Santa emerged from the main building midway through that sudden conference. He took in the sight of his famous reindeer standing quietly at the center of several worried elves and went pale beneath his beard. "What is going on?" he asked. His voice was firm, but held a thread of genuine alarm. Mikkel stepped forward, spreading his hands. "We are seeing reduced luminosity in the lead reindeer," he said. "We will of course run full diagnostics. It is probably temporary." Probably. Rudolph noticed Santa's grip tighten on the reins he held, though there was no sleigh attached yet. For all his grumpiness and logistical obsession, Santa understood things very clearly. Without that red glow, certain nights became much harder. He also understood that pushing a failing light into service might be unwise. Rudolph bowed his head slightly, as if to say he wished it were otherwise. Inside, he walked a careful line between honesty and quiet strategy. He did feel unwell. He also felt that his body had finally found a way to express what his words had not. Santa hesitated, then sighed. "All right," he said slowly. "We will adjust tonight's plans. No extended tours. We will stick to essential routes. The rest can be rescheduled." The elves nodded, already pulling out alternate route maps and muttering about backup formations. As they turned away, Rudolph felt something unexpected. Relief. He had not shouted. He had not staged a dramatic strike. He had simply refused, in the most physical way his magic allowed, to pretend he could keep shining at full power without a pause. It was a small act, easily dismissed as a temporary malfunction, but he knew the truth. A line had been crossed, even if gently. Later that day, as the reindeer rested in the stable, the topic of boundaries finally reached the hay. Blitzen spoke first. He mentioned, in a cautious tone, that perhaps they should talk about the workload, not in an angry way, just in a practical, we would like to continue existing way. Dasher snorted, amused and tired. He said that he never thought he would see the day when Rudolph had a dim nose and he himself was the one suggesting moderation, but here they were. Vixen, lying on her side with her legs stretched out, added that elves had regular breaks written into their schedules. She had seen the charts. The reindeer did not. In the corner stall, Prancer remarked that there was a word humans used for this kind of conversation: union. The stable fell quiet for a moment. They were not particularly political creatures, these reindeer. They were more familiar with wind patterns than negotiation tactics, but they understood fairness in a very direct, bodily way. They knew when a load felt reasonable, and when it did not. So they had a meeting. It was not grand, no banners, no speeches from a raised platform, just a circle of reindeer in a warm stable, noses dimmed, breath fogging the air. They discussed what a reasonable night looked like, how long they could fly before their legs began to shake, how many pre-Christmas events could be added before they stopped enjoying any of them. They talked about the way their sleep felt thinner now, more easily broken. They admitted with some embarrassment that a few of them sometimes dreaded the sound of harness bells. Through it all, Rudolph listened. He had spent years quietly absorbing more and more work, telling himself that loyalty required it. Now, hearing the others speak honestly, he realized that his idea of loyalty had been missing an important part: loyalty to self. When the conversation finished, they did not vow to overthrow the system. They were still reindeer after all. They had traditions and affection for Santa. What they agreed on was simpler. They would speak together next time, not just one of them quietly confessing their tiredness in a private meeting, but several, presenting the reality of their shared experience. They did not know when that moment would come. Fate, as it often does, supplied an opportunity faster than expected. A few days later, an elf named Ina arrived in the stable with a stack of papers and an apologetic expression. She was one of the logistics elves, the kind who lived inside schedules and maps. Her spectacles were slightly crooked, her scarf patterned with tiny reindeer silhouettes. She explained that she had been going over the data, flight durations, rest periods, output levels from Rudolph's nose, strain readings on muscle groups. The elves had enchanted harnesses that reported such things now, because of course they did. She shuffled her papers and confessed that the numbers did not look entirely comfortable. Rudolph raised an ear, interested. Ina went on. She showed them a simple chart she had drawn, using plain ink rather than magic. It displayed, in no uncertain terms, that the average workload had nearly doubled over the last few centuries, while the officially scheduled rest had increased hardly at all. She admitted, in a very quiet voice, that some elves were concerned. They liked their work, they cared about the holiday, they also cared about the reindeer, who happened to be the only ones capable of pulling the sleigh through certain kinds of weather. She was not officially authorized to share all of this. But she did so anyway, sliding the chart under Rudolph's nose as if it were a secret map to a gentler future. He studied the lines, the upward slope of effort, the relatively flat line of rest. It was one thing to feel tired. It was another thing to see that tiredness drawn on paper. For the first time, he felt firmly that the problem was not in his imagination, it was in the structure. Anur added done more peace. She said that Santa was not ignoring the issue on purpose. He was, by her careful and slightly fond description, overwhelmed. The data came in too quickly. The expectations weighed on him also. He reacted by gripping the reins tighter, not by loosening them. He needed someone, she suggested, to say clearly that the current pace was not sustainable. Preferably someone he could not easily ignore. Several sets of reindeer eyes turned toward Rudolph. He sighed, deeply and without drama. Of course. Of all the creatures at the North Pole, he was the most obvious candidate to deliver that message. He hated that this was true. He also could not deny that it was. The small rebellion of the dimmed nose had opened a door. Now there were elves with charts standing in the doorway, politely asking if he might step through and perhaps bring Santa with him. Word of their stable conversations and of Ina's charts reached Santa eventually. The North Pole, despite its size, functioned like a small town. Information travelled in gentle meanderer paths. An elf mentioned to Mikkel that the reindeer were talking about boundaries. Mikkel mentioned to Mrs. Claus that Ina had charts. Mrs. Claus raised an eyebrow. Then a day later, Santa walked into the stables unannounced. He stood there in the straw-scented aisle, his red coat brushing against the stall doors, his boots sprinkled with snow. The reindeer turned their heads to look at him, ears flicking. He cleared his throat in that way he did when he was trying to appear calm while feeling anything but. He said that he had heard whispers, that they were concerned about the workload, that Rudolph's recent nose trouble had made him think. He tried to keep his voice light, but the tension was visible in his shoulders. Rudolph stepped forward from his stool, feeling the weight of many eyes on his back. He did not flare his nose. He kept it at a steady, moderate glow, enough to light the aisle, not enough to dazzle. He met Santa's gaze. In that quiet moment, without grand speeches or background music, Santa finally understood something he had been avoiding. His most trusted reindeer was not simply tired. He was approaching a point where, if nothing changed, the magic that had saved them all those years ago might sputter out. Santa's grumpiness softened into something more vulnerable. He looked smaller, just for a heartbeat, in that long aisle of stalls. He said that they would talk properly, that he needed some time to untangle his own thoughts, that for now they would slow the schedule just slightly and cancel one or two non-essential events. It was not enough, but it was a start. As he left, snow swirling in through the briefly opened door, the reindeer let out a collective breath they had not realized they were holding. Small rebellions, it seemed, could move large sleighs. Rudolph returned to his stall, lay down and rested his head on his forelegs. His nose glowed gently, feeling a fraction lighter. The road ahead was still long and full of flights. Santa was still Santa. The world still ordered everything. But now there were charts, conversations, and the first tiny cracks in the assumption that the reindeer could simply shine forever without complaint. For the first time in many seasons, Rudolph did not feel alone under his own light. Chapter 7. The Christmas That Almost Fell Apart. The storm arrived with a sense of humour that Rudolph did not appreciate. It began as a normal winter system on the maps, a cluster of unsettled air over the northern oceans. The workshop screens showed the usual swirls and colours. Elves murmured about wind speeds and pressure gradients. Santa frowned in his standard seasonal way and said that they had seen worse. Technically, that was true. The legendary Foggy Night still held the record for drama, but this storm was not interested in breaking old records in glamorous ways. It preferred to simply be everywhere at once. By the morning of Christmas Eve, the world map in the briefing hall looked as if someone had smeared grey paint over half the northern hemisphere. Clouds upon clouds, snow stacked over snow, crosswinds layered in different directions just to keep things interesting. Rudolph watched the display with a steady expression and a quietly sinking feeling. He was older now, not ancient, but well beyond the reckless years when his main response to bad weather had been a sort of excited determination. His bones murmured when storms rolled in. His shoulders remembered every gust they had pushed through. Santa stood at the front of the hall, arms folded, beard a little more silver than white in the cold light. He spoke in his briefing voice, the one that tried to sound confident even when his eyes gave away his tension. He referenced the storm, he acknowledged the difficult conditions, he reminded them of their experience and their magic. He did not mention that his lead reindeer had only recently engaged in a small, subtle rebellion of reduced brightness. Rudolph listened with calm attention and a gentle internal commentary. Of course, the big storm waited until after they had acknowledged the need for balance. Weather had always loved timing. The day moved in a blur of preparation. Elves double-checked harnesses. The sleigh was fortified with extra enchantments against ice build-up. Routes were revised 3 times as the storm shifted shape. In the stables, the reindeer went through their pre-flight rituals in a focused silence. Dasher stretched every muscle in a precise sequence. Vixen stood with eyes closed, breathing slowly. Blitzen hummed an old reindeer travel song under his breath. Prancer fidgeted in place, not from nerves but from tightly coiled energy. Rudolph submitted to his nose brightness calibration without comment. The reading showed he was within safe limits. The technician nodded with cautious approval. "You do not need to push to full power unless absolutely necessary," the elf reminded him. Rudolph appreciated the sentiment. He also knew that storms and necessity had a long history of working together. As dusk fell at the North Pole, they assembled at the runway. Snow rolled in from the horizon, driven by a wind that did not bother to introduce itself. The sky above was a heavy bowl of cloud. There were no visible stars. Even the aurora seemed to have taken the night off, perhaps deciding that the storm had enough drama on its own. Santa climbed into the sleigh, cloak snapping in the wind. He checked the harness connections himself, tugging at each strap. His usual pre-flight jokes were thinner than usual, like ribbons stretched across too many packages. Rudolph took his place at the front, feeling the familiar weight of leather and bells. The rest of the team lined up behind him, 8 strong shapes against the snow-filled air. Santa called the count. The elves responded with cheers that the wind immediately tried to steal. Then they were racing forward, hooves pounding the packed snow, sleigh runners hissing. The ground fell away with the usual heart-lifting rush. The storm greeted them politely and then attempted to swallow them whole. Within minutes, the world became a moving wall of white. Snowflakes hurled themselves at their faces with aggressive enthusiasm. Wind shoved at their sides, trying to slide the sleigh off course. Clouds pressed in from every direction, erasing anything that might have been a landmark. Rudolph brought his nose to a firm, bright glow. The red beam cut a path through the chaos, painting the snow-filled air with color. It helped that this storm was not a simple fog that could be easily carved into tunnels. The wind shifted without warning, forcing quick course corrections. Ice formed stubbornly on the sleigh rails and had to be shaken off in jolting bursts. Visibility fluctuated from bad to worse and back again. They pressed on, over northern forests and frozen lakes, over small towns whose lights flickered bravely under the storm, over cities where streets glowed even as snow piled up on rooftops. Rudolph kept his focus narrowed to a tight cone ahead. The rest of the world shrank to a pattern of movement and adjustment. Nose angle, wing position, harness tension. Santa's voice calling out subtle course changes above the roar of the wind. For a while it worked. They were behind schedule, but not disastrously so. Santa made careful trade-offs, skipping certain less populated areas early in the night with plans to circle back if time allowed. He prioritized regions with the youngest children, a calculation that had somehow become instinct over the years. Then the errors began. They were small at first. A missed turn over a stretch of suburbs where every house looked the same through the snow, a chimney slightly overflown that required a clumsy backtrack, a landing on the wrong apartment block rooftop that forced Santa to jog across to the correct building, boots slipping on ice, muttering under his breath. The team compensated as best they could. Reindeer adjusted formation when gusts hit from unexpected angles. Santa recalculated on the fly, measuring what they had already covered against what remained. But the storm did not tire. If anything, it grew more energetic as the night went on, as though fueled by the challenge. Rudolph felt the strain settling into his muscles like wet sand. His glow stayed bright, but maintaining that brightness began to cost more with each passing hour. The ache behind his eyes crept outward, down his neck into his shoulders. At done points somewhere over a sprawling city where the grid of streets blurred under endless snow, they overshot an entire neighborhood. Santa noticed too late. By the time he realized, doubling back would have meant sacrificing another planned region later in the night. He stared down at the map, jaw tight, and chose to keep moving forward. Rudolph saw the calculation in his face. He felt the weight of it land with the snow on their backs. As they climbed higher to clear a bank of unexpectedly tall skyscrapers, a gust hit them broadside with the casual rudeness of uninvited weather. The sleigh lurched, reindeer staggered in the air, hooves scrambling against nothing, harness bells shrieked. For a terrifying heartbeat they dangled at an angle, sleigh tipping, gifts shifting dangerously. Rudolph reacted before conscious thought arrived. He flared his nose to its absolute highest shine, throwing every remaining scrap of energy into the light. The red beam punched through the snow and found a fragile gap between two cloud layers. He called out with a sharp sound that the team recognized as, "Up. Now." They surged together, a single coordinated group. Muscles pulling hard, wings angled dust so, hooves driving through the turbulent air. The sleigh righted with a groan, skimming the edge of the gap. They burst through into slightly calmer air, leaving the worst of that particular gust below. For a moment there was only breathing. Heavy, ragged, grateful breathing. Santa's face was pale. He did not speak. His hands gripped the reins so tightly that the leather creaked. Rudolph felt the aftershocks of strain ripple through his body. His nose maintained its blinding glow for a few more seconds, then dropped back to something sustainable completely on its own, ignoring even his attempt to keep it higher. He took the hint. They continued the route with renewed caution. Santa checked on each reindeer by name whenever they had a brief patch of slightly quieter sky. Donder nodded stiffly. Cupid rolled one shoulder and said he was fine in the way people do when they are not, but prefer to deal with it later. The others gave similar responses. Rudolph answered honestly when Santa asked him. He said he was tired but functional. He did not add that a small part of him wished, set for a moment, that the storm would hand them a respectable excuse to stop. There was still the job. They finished Europe later than planned. Asia, with its distances and time zones, stretched before them like an accusation. Santa adjusted the route again, sacrificing the neat circular path in favor of a series of sharp, efficient lines. Efficiency, Rudolph thought, was starting to sound suspiciously like to the point of collapse. At some stage in the deep hours when night and early morning overlap, the inevitable happened. Santa snapped. It did not come out of nowhere. The pressure had been building for hours. The constant tug of the wind, the loud silence of missed neighborhoods, the knowledge that every decision left some child waiting longer than they should. They were over a dense city where high-rises reached toward the clouds. Snow swirled between them in dizzying patterns. Rudolph misjudged the height of a rooftop by just enough that Santa had to jump clumsily, landing harder than usual. He stumbled, caught himself on a chimney, and muttered something ungracious about aging knees. Back in the sleigh, as they lifted off again, the frustration finally boiled over. Santa turned toward the front of the team, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. His voice, when it came, was sharp in a way it almost never was. He told Rudolph that his navigation had been off all night, that they were late, badly late, that missed turns and small errors were adding up, that this was not acceptable on a night like this. The words were not shouted. That almost made them worse. They landed in the heart of Rudolph's chest with a heavy thud. He did not argue. He could have pointed out the wind shear, the whiteout conditions, the updated routes arriving mid-flight. He could have politely reminded Santa that his own decisions about detours and backtracks had contributed to the delays. Instead, he simply listened. His nose dimmed slightly, more from the emotional impact than from the storm. The redness of it reflected faintly in Santa's eyes as the sleigh bumped back into the air. The rest of the team felt the tension like static. Their ears flattened, their wing beats went a fraction out of sync until they forced themselves back into rhythm. They continued the night in a strained silence. Santa spoke only when necessary, calling out directions, checking coordinates. The easy jokes were gone. The small moments of shared wonder vanished into the storm. Rudolph retreated inward. He did his job with careful precision, if anything more accurately than before. His world narrowed to the beam of light, the feel of pressure in the harness, the knowledge that this night would leave a bruise somewhere deep under his fur. By the time they reached the final leg of the route, dawn was pressing at the edges of the sky. They raced against it in a last push that left all of them shaking. Home appeared at last. The familiar glow of the North Pole rose out of the storm like a lighthouse. They landed in a flurry of snow and exhausted hooves. Elves rushed forward, cheering weakly, overwhelmed by relief and the sheer scale of work just completed. Santa climbed slowly from the sleigh. His movements were stiff. His beard was crusted with ice. He looked at the team as if seeing them from very far away. He mumbled something about a debrief later and trudged toward the main building, shoulders hunched. The reindeer stood in their traces for a moment, steam rising from their bodies, bells hanging limp. Rudolph felt hollow. It had been a hard night. That much was expected. What he had not expected was the sharpness of Santa's words. For all his grumbling and logistical obsession, Santa rarely let his frustration aim directly at the team, and almost never at Rudolph. That had changed. The elves unhitched them with gentle hands. No one mentioned the tension. They focused on practical tasks, warm blankets, towels to rub down damp coats, hot mash in heavy bowls. One by one, the reindeer retreated to their stalls. Rudolph entered his stall and lay down almost immediately. His legs trembled with residual effort. His nose glowed faintly, more from habit than intention. He stared at the wooden wall in front of him. The storm had been fierce, but it was already beginning to move on. The emotional weather, however, remained unsettled. The bond between him and Santa had always been complex, a mix of trust, duty, and shared history. Now there was a crack in it. He did not feel angry in the loud, stomping way. He felt quietly wounded, the kind of hurt that makes an old scar ache in bad weather. In the stall across from him, Blitzen shifted restlessly. Down the row, Vixen let out a low sigh. Dasher muttered something about the wind that was technically unkind but understandable. No one spoke directly about Santa's remark. They did not need to. It hung in the air like residual fog. The stable lights dimmed to a soft glow. Outside, the storm finally began to loosen its grip on the sky. Snow fell more gently. The wind slowed, as if tired of its own performance. Rudolph closed his eyes. Sleep came eventually, heavy and dreamless. What he did not know yet was that the person most disturbed by what had happened on that sleigh was not him. It was Mrs. Claus. Chapter 8. The Long Talk in the Snow. The North Pole was quiet in the hours after a successful Christmas run. Elves moved more slowly, tools were put away, the workshop lights softened. Someone always started a large pot of stew in the kitchen, a tradition older than most of the decorations. Santa usually retreated to his study for a short rest and a long cup of something hot. He would remove his boots with a groan, unfasten his heavy belt, and sink into his favourite chair with the deliberate gratitude of a man who had once again crossed the world in Nan's short night. This time, he did all of those things, but the rest did not take. He sat in his chair, mug in hand, staring at the fire. The flames licked the logs with gentle enthusiasm. Shadows moved on the walls, flickering over old maps and framed lists from earlier centuries. His mind would not settle. He saw again the sleigh lurching in the storm, the moment of near disaster. He heard his own voice snapping at Rudolph. The words echoed in his head with uncomfortable clarity. "You have been off all night. This is not acceptable." At the time, they had felt like necessary urgency, the kind of sharp instruction a leader sometimes needed to give in dangerous conditions. Now, in the quiet, they sounded exactly like what they were: unfair. Rudolph had not been careless. The storm had been relentless. Santa knew this. He knew it in his bones, which ached in their own way from gripping the reins for so many hours. Yet he had let his frustration spill outward instead of sitting with it. He took a slow sip from his mug. The drink had gone lukewarm. Mrs. Claus entered the study without knocking, which was her privilege, and also something she did when she suspected he needed to be interrupted. She wore a thick sweater and sensible boots, her grey hair pinned up loosely. Her eyes, kind and sharp in equal measure, took the long sweeping look around the room before resting on Santa's face. He attempted a tired smile. It did not quite make it to his eyes. She sat down in the chair opposite him, the one that had gradually become hers over the centuries without anyone formally acknowledging it. "Rough night," she said. Santa nodded. Storm was worse than expected. She let that answer sit for a moment, then added quietly, "I heard you and Rudolph," she said, "on the sleigh." Santa winced. He should have known, of course. Magic carried sound in odd ways. The workshop was full of enchantments that kept track of the sleigh for safety. Sometimes they carried back more than coordinates. She continued in the same calm tone. "You were harsh," she said. Harsher than he deserved. Santa sighed, heavy and slow. "I was scared," he admitted. "We were late. The storm kept shifting. The lists get longer every year. I see all those blinking lights on the map, all those expectations. And in that moment it felt as if everything rested on that one beam of red light staying perfectly steady." Mrs. Claus watched him carefully. "Does it?" she asked. "Does everything truly rest on that one nose?" He hesitated. The honest answer, of course, was no. Magic had layers. Other reindeer had keen senses and long experience. Elves kept things running with impressive skills. Belief came from a whole world of people choosing to hold on to a bit of wonder for one more year. But it was easier, in his tired mind, to compress all of that into the single bright symbol at the front of the team. He said nothing. Mrs. Claus leaned back slightly, hands folded in her lap. "You have been carrying a lot," she acknowledged. "The screens, the numbers, the new systems. It is a different world than it was when you started this. You have not had the time to fully grieve the loss of that simpler time." Santa considered arguing that he was above such feelings, that he was a myth, not a man. He did not. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his beard. "The children still believe," he said. "That is what matters." She nodded. "Yes," she agreed. "They do. And they will if you keep your promises and treat the ones who help you keep them with care. That includes the reindeer, especially the one who has been at the front longer than anyone else." Santa looked back at the fire. He saw Rudolph in his mind, standing in the stable aisle with his nose set to a moderate glow, calm and tired. He remembered the small rebellion of the dimmed nose, the stable meetings. The chart's inner had hesitantly shown him. He remembered telling himself he would address it all properly when he had time. Time had a way of filling itself with emergencies. Mrs. Claus continued, voice gentle but firm. "You know he is tired," she said. "At the end of a long night tired, deep down tired, the kind that does not vanish after one extra nap. You also know that you have leaned on him because it is easy to believe he can carry everything." Santa opened his mouth to protest, to say that he never meant to lean too hard, that he had simply trusted Rudolph's strength. She raised down hands slightly, stopping him before the excuses could form. "Trusting someone," she said, "does not mean using them to the edge of breaking." You have been scared, so you have clung to the one part of the story you felt you could control. The red nose, the legend, the symbol. She leaned forward, eyes steady. But he is not a symbol, she said. He is a living reindeer who has carried you through more winters than I care to count. And last night, in your fear, you forgot that. The words landed with the same undeniable weight as fresh snow on a roof. Santa stared at his hands. I know, he said quietly. For a moment they sat together in silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm continued to mutter, now more like an old aunt complaining in another room than an immediate threat. Mrs. Claus spoke again, her tone softer now. You are not a bad person, she said. You are a tired nonce, and tired people say things they regret. The question is what you do next. Santa looked up. What do you suggest? He asked, and there was no defensiveness in it, only a genuine request. She gave a small smile. You go outside, she said. You find Rudolph, you take a walk. No screens, no maps, no charts, just you, him and the snow. Then you listen. He almost laughed. It sounded a little like the old chucker children knew, but it was thinner. You make it sound easy, he said. She shook her head. No, she replied. I make it sound simple. Those are not the same thing. He sat with that distinction for a moment, then nodded. He stood, joints protesting. He pulled on his boots again, wrapped himself in his cloak, and headed for the door. Mrs. Claus watched him go with a mixture of affection and worry, as she had done for a very long time. Then she turned back to the fire, trusting the snow outside to do its quiet work. The storm had calmed enough that the yard was visible when Santa stepped outside. Snow lay in thick drifts along the buildings. The sky was a soft grey, streaked with the last remnants of cloud. A faint hint of northern lights hung on the horizon, as if waiting to see if they were needed. The stable was quiet when he entered. Most of the reindeer were asleep, or pretending to be, while staying alert enough to track any interesting sounds. Rudolph's stall was near the far end, as it had been for years. Santa walked down the aisle, boots muffled on straw, nodding to any open eyes that watched him pass. Rudolph lay curled in his stall, head resting on his forelegs. His eyes were closed, but his ears flicked as Santa approached. The nose glowed with a faint, steady light, just enough to trace the outline of his muzzle. Santa stopped at the door. For a moment he simply stood there, uncertain how to begin. Finally he cleared his throat, quieter than in the briefing hall. Rudolph opened his eyes. They were calm, readable, and very tired. Santa spoke. He said that the night had been hard, that he had been frightened by how close they had come to losing control of the sleigh, that he had lashed out at the nearest target, which had happened to be the one creature working as hard as he was. He admitted in plain language that he had been wrong to speak to Rudolph that way. The words did not transform the air with magic, they did not repair everything in an instant, but they had weight, and Santa let that weight rest between them without trying to joke it away. Rudolph pushed himself slowly to his feet. He stepped forward until he stood at the edge of the stall, separated from Santa by a simple wooden door. His nose cast a soft red glow onto the front of Santa's cloak. He did not make a dramatic speech in response, but he did something he had not done fully before. He told the truth. In a series of quiet sounds, gestures, and looks that Santa had long ago learned to understand, he laid out the reality of his experience. He spoke of centuries of flights, of storm after storm, of city lights growing brighter and more confusing, of digital maps that constantly expanded, of pre-Christmas tours that stretched the season from a focused sprint into a drawn-out strain. He spoke about the small rebellions, the dimmed nose, the meetings in the stable, the charts Ina had drawn, the way his body now took longer to return to full strength between seasons. He admitted that he still loved parts of the work, the moment when they rose above clouds into clear starlight, the quiet villages snuggled into snow, the houses where someone had left a single candle burning in a window. But he also admitted that he no longer felt that quiet excitement at the first sign of the season. Instead, there was dread, a soft, heavy dread. Santa listened. For once, he did not interrupt with logistical solutions. He did not rush to offer new efficiency measures or updated schedules. He simply stood in the straw-scented air and let Rudolph's tired truth wash over him. As the reindeer finished, Santa realized something that should have been obvious. He was not the only wet frightened of failing. Rudolph was frightened too. Not of storms or missed turns. He had faced those for years. He was frightened of being asked, again and again, to give just a little more than he had, until one day there was nothing left. Santa felt shame prickling under his collar. Not the kind that leads to defensive excuses, but the kind that pushes a person toward change. He stepped closer, resting a gloved hand on the stall door. He promised Rudolph as plainly as he could that he would not let things continue as they had. He admitted that he did not yet know exactly how to fix it, that the world would still send its digital lists and that storms would still form without checking his schedule. But he could change how he responded to those pressures. He could share the load instead of directing all his fear toward the front of the harness. He spoke of practical steps, training more reindeer for lead positions, redistributing appearances so that no one nose, however famous, had to shine at every event, reviewing routes with rest in mind as well as coverage, limiting non-essential tours even if it meant saying no to some invitations from important-sounding committees. He then added something more personal. He said that he would make space, in his own mind, to remember that Rudolph was his friend, not his tool. He let that word settle between them. Friend. It was not a word they said often. Their relationship had been built in motion, in storms and over rooftops, with little time for formal definitions. But it was true. Rudolph watched him closely. The nose brightened a little, not in a blinding flare but in a warm acknowledgement. He stepped closer still, until his forehead touched Santa's chest for a brief, solid moment. It was a simple gesture. It carried centuries. Santa rested his hand lightly on Rudolph's neck. Outside, as if on cue, the clouds thinned. A band of northern lights unfurled across the sky, pale and shifting. The color that glowed strongest was not green this time, but a soft, strange red, as if even the aurora had decided to offer a small tribute. Santa suggested a walk. Rudolph, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. They left the stable together, moving slowly through the hushed yard. No sleigh, no harness, just one man in a red cloak and reindeer with a tired but steady glow. They walked past the runway, now covered in fresh snow, past the workshop where a few late-working elves waved from upper windows, past the last lantern post into the open white. The snow lay deep, but Rudolph made a path easily, hooves sinking with solid confidence. Santa followed in his wake, cloak brush of the tops of the drifts. For a while they did not. The sky above them deepened to a darker grey, then slowly to indigo. Stars appeared one by one, shy but persistent. The storm had finally let go. After some distance, Santa spoke again. He told small stories about earlier centuries, times when the hardest part of the job had been convincing people that magic might exist, times when they had flown over mostly dark landscapes, with only the occasional lamp or fireplace below. He admitted that he missed those nights, that he sometimes felt lost in the new world of constant light and noise, that the screens in the workshop made him feel older than his beard ever had. Rudolph listened, understand in a new way that the weight he carried in the harness had its match in the weight Santa carried in his head. They both had been pretending to be fine for each other, hoping the other would not notice the cracks. They reached a small rise beyond the main buildings. From there, the North Pole compound looked almost cozy, lights glowing like a cluster of candles in the snow, smoke curling from chimneys, the faint sound of songs drifting across the cold air. They stood there together. The night felt different than it had in a long time. Not easier, yet. Change would take work. It always did. But there was a sense that the story had turned slightly, as if nudged onto a better track. Santa turned to Rudolph. "We will redesign this," he said quietly. "Not at the roots, the whole way we think about the work. You will not have to carry everything forever." Rudolph inclined his head. He did not blindly trust promises anymore. Experience had taught him that good intentions sometimes dissolved under pressure, but he saw something in Santa's face that he had not seen clearly before. Not do, worry. Not do, determination. Humility. That, more than any speech, convinced him that this time might be different. They walked back in companionable silence, leaving a trail of footprints glowing faintly red where Rudolph's light touched the snow. At the edge of the yard, an elf on late duty glanced up, saw them together, and allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Inside the stable, as Rudolph settled back into his stall, the other reindeer watched him with quiet curiosity. They saw the softenings around his eyes, the way his shoulders sat a little lower, as if someone had removed a small but persistent weight. They noticed the absence of sharp tension in the air. Blitzen asked, gently, how it had gone. Rudolph answered in a few simple sounds. Better, he said without words. Not fixed, but better. He lay down, straw rustling. His nose dimmed to a soft, content glow that filled the stall with warm red light. Somewhere in the workshop, Mrs. Claus put another log on the fire and allowed herself to relax. The conversation in the snow had not magically reorganized centuries of habit. It had not reduced the number of digital wish lists or convinced the weather to schedule storms more politely. But it had done something equally important. It had reminded the two beings at the heart of this vast yearly effort that they were on the same side, both tired, both hopeful, both capable of change. The next season would not arrive for many months. When it did, the North Pole would not be quite the same. Chapter 9. Rebuilding Christmas from the Inside. Change at the North Pole did not arrive with trumpets and banners. It arrived as a new chart pinned quietly to a stable wall. It was drawn by Ina, in her careful, slightly crooked handwriting. At first glance it looked like any other schedule. Columns for regions, rows for dates, arrows indicating flights, nothing unusual. Then the reindeer noticed something strange. Their names did not appear in the same places every time. For as long as most of them could remember, the pattern had been almost sacred. Rudolph at the front for the big night, Rudolph at the front for anything remotely complicated, Rudolph at the front for most major events, because why not lean on what works? Now, scattered across the chart, other names appeared in the lead position. Dasher, listed as lead for a mid-season storm training run. Vixen, placed at the front for a series of practice routes over Europe. Comet, promoted to lead on a trial basis for a quiet region with predictable winds. Rudolph's name was still there, of course. He had not been demoted to decorative pasture ornament, but it was no longer the only name with the little star beside it. That alone made the air feel different in the stable. Santa stood beside the chart, looking more serious than ceremonial. "We are increased the number of trained leads," he explained. "It is time we stop pretending our nose can carry the whole sky." His voice was wry, and yes, faintly apologetic. The reindeer studied the schedule. Some ears twitched with nerves. The lead position came with extra attention and extra responsibility. Others swelled with a quiet, cautious pride. Rudolph watched from a small distance. He felt his usual tug towards stepping in and offering to cover everything. Habit is powerful, especially when wrapped in the comforting blanket of hero stories, but he kept still. This was the point. If the load was to be shared, he had to actually let others carry it. Training flights began a few days later. Rudolph took to the air with Vixen at the front, his place shifted back in the formation. The sensation was curious, like standing just behind a mirror and watching someone else test out an expression he had worn for centuries. Vixen flew with precise focus, her nose unremarkable in color but sharp in instinct. She learned quickly how to read the wind, how to adjust angle for cross-currents, how to judge the distance between clouds and rooftops. Rudolph called out the occasional soft correction, but mostly he let her figure things out with her own senses. There were mistakes, of course. On one test route they drifted slightly off the ideal line and ended up circling a small Norwegian town 3 times before finding the best approach. On another, a misjudged gust over a frozen lake had them landing at a less than graceful angle. Rudolph felt his muscles twitch with the urge to jump in, to flare his nose and take over. Instead he breathed, counted a few steady heartbeats and let Vixen correct. They returned to the North Pole tired but intact. Back in the stable, Santa debriefed the flight with an attitude that surprised everyone, including himself. He did not demand perfection. He noted the errors, yes, but framed them as steps in learning. He praised Vixen's quick recovery when things went wrong. He asked Rudolph for his assessment, and listened carefully when Rudolph said that allowing small mistakes now would prevent larger ones later. The second new lead to train was Comet, whose confidence sometimes outran his caution. On his first run, he flew with enthusiasm that made the sleigh ring like a bell. Rudolph, again positioned slightly behind, offered calm, occasionally sarcastic commentary. "Try not to treat the sky as a racetrack," his ears seemed to say when Comet took a turn a bit too sharply. Comet laughed breathlessly and adjusted. Over time, the roster on the wall began to look less like one line written in ink, and more like a web of shared responsibility. This was only the first part of the rebuilding. The second part involved something Santa had successfully avoided considering for a very long time: Rudolph's time off. Not a short afternoon nap. Not an extra day between events. Actual time away from the harness. An extended pause in which he would not be the first name on every emergency list. The idea made Santa's eyebrows climb toward his hat. What if something goes wrong? He asked Mrs. Claus one evening as they reviewed the new plans by lamplight. She raised an eyebrow in return. "If something goes wrong," she said, "you will have a team of trained leads, several experienced co-pilots, and a reindeer who is not completely worn down by the time you need him again." Santa opened his mouth, realized there was no sensible counter-argument, and closed it. The decision was made. After Wadmore's season of careful transition, Rudolph would step back for a while. The announcement, when it came, was delivered in the stable, where most of the important news lived these days. Santa told the reindeer that starting next year, Rudolph would take a slower role. He would still fly sometimes, especially for early parts of the season and certain routes, but he would no longer be the default for every high-pressure situation. A portion of the season, perhaps even an entire year now and then, would see him grounded by design. The stable fell silent. Rudolph felt a strange mix of sensations: relief, rising like warm air inside his chest, anxiety, fluttering like a nervous bird in his stomach, and something almost like grief for a part of himself that had been defined by constant motion. Blitzen broke the quiet with a dry remark. "About time someone let the legend have a nap." Laughter rippled through the stalls, weary but real. When the first long pause came, it did not look like a grand farewell. It began in autumn when the air turned sharp and the preparations started, as always, with lists and maps and small panics. Rudolph helped with training flights. He advised on routes. He accompanied new leads on their practice runs as a calm, steady presence. But when the main global schedule was pinned up, his name appeared only in a few carefully chosen places. The rest of the time, he was listed as reserve. It felt like standing in a doorway between two rooms. He watched Comet lead a mid-season storm run and return, energized and proud. He watched Vixen handle a tricky sequence of landings across small towns, and come back with eyes bright and tired in a satisfying way. He watched Dasher, for once, focus more on accuracy than speed. He also watched Santa, who seemed taller somehow, now that he was not hiding his fear behind constant demands on a single reindeer. With others sharing the front, Santa began to loosen his grip on the reins, literally and metaphorically. He delegated more tasks to elves, allowed them to design and own whole portions of the operation. He even let go of 3 non-essential events that had been lingering on the calendar like decorations no one really liked but kept hanging up out of habit. The North Pole workshops changed as well. At Ina's urging, large windows were added to some of the main rooms. It turned out that even magical creatures benefit from seeing the sky while they work. Elves paused sometimes to watch snow falling in slow, elegant curtains. They breathed differently after that. Break rooms were expanded. Not the cramped corners where people grabbed cocoa on the run, but actual spaces with chairs that invited sitting down properly. Shelves appeared, holding games and storybooks. someone introduced the concept of an officially scheduled nap for elves working overnight shifts. It was initially met with suspicion and then quickly with deep appreciation. Mrs. Claus insisted on movable benches being placed near the runway, so that after difficult flights, reindeer and elves and even Santa could sit together for a moment before everyone scattered to their next tasks. "You are allowed to arrive somewhere without immediately leaving again," she declared. It became a quiet rule. Rudolph, during his extended rest, found the world looked different when he was not always racing over it. He spent almost an entire season not leaving the ground. At first he did not quite know what to do with himself. He walked. He moved through the North Pole compound at a slower pace, noticing details he had often missed before. The pattern of frost on workshop windows, the way laurel wreaths swayed slightly in the wind, the small carved animals on the ends of stable rafters that some elf long ago had snuck in for amusement. He travelled beyond the pole as well, but without the sleigh. Santa arranged for a series of sabbatical trips, as some very earnest elf called them, with a twinkle that said he enjoyed using big words for simple things. Sometimes Rudolph went alone, carried by quieter strands of magic that moved like gentle currents more than shooting stars. Other times, an elf companion came along to handle human paperwork and misunderstandings. He walked through winter forests in Scandinavia where the trees creaked softly under the weight of snow. He watched small villages light candles in windows at dusk. He stood on hills overlooking towns in Lapland, listening to the faint sound of carols drifting up through the cold air. He visited a market in a German village, slipping into a stable behind the scene while an elf explained his presence to a very surprised local farmer. From there, with the door slightly open, he watched people wander among stalls selling warm pastries and handmade ornaments. No one looked up expecting to see him pass overhead. He found that deeply soothing. He discovered that he enjoyed Christmas more as a quiet observer than as a constantly moving courier of joy. In Nen's small town, he watched a family decorate a tree in their living room. They argued gently about where to place a particular ornament that clearly had more sentimental value than aesthetic sense. They laughed. They stepped back and admired their imperfect, entirely endearing work. He felt a warm ache in his chest. This was what all the lists and routes were for. Not the sales, not the events, but moments like that, lived slowly by people who had no idea a very tired reindeer was watching them from the shadows of a nearby street. Back at the North Pole, change continued. The workshop shifted away from the frantic rush that had once defined the final weeks. Work was spread more evenly through the year. New departments were formed, overseeing repairs, research, even elf education. Someone started a choir not attached to production quotas. Santa learned to take rest seriously, not as an optional suggestion but as a requirement. Mrs. Claus had a hand in that. On certain afternoons when she caught him leaning too hard over maps or screens, she would appear with 2 mugs of cocoa and a firm request. "Walk," she would say. They would walk together through the snow. Sometimes Rudolph joined them. Those walks became their own kind of planning session, one where they talked less about routes and more about values. What did they want the work to feel like? Not just for the children receiving presents, but for the ones making and delivering them. Respectful was one word that came up often, sustainable another, joyful when possible. Rudolph listened to these conversations and felt something inside him begin to unknot. The story of his life was no longer being told only in terms of sacrifice and constant effort. There was room now for repair, for boundaries, for a more humane magic. He also noticed the younger reindeer. They watched him with a curious mix of awe and relatability. To them, he was a figure from stories who was also, suddenly, a regular presence in the stable yard during times when previously he would have been a blur in the sky. They would side up to him at feeding time, pretending to be interested only in the mash, then ask small question. "What did it feel like the first time you flew? Is the Foggy Night song accurate? Do you still get nervous?" Rudolph answered with his usual calm, lightly sarcastic honesty. He admitted that the song took certain liberties, that he had been terrified during that first storm, that he still felt a tightness in his chest before difficult flights even now. He did not present himself as invincible. he presented himself as experienced. There is a difference, and the younger ones noticed. In the workshops, elves told and retold the story of Rudolph, but with new chapters added at the end. They spoke not only of the miraculous night and the famous red nose, but also of the time he dimmed that nose on purpose when he needed help, of the stable meetings, of the charts that showed plainly that magic had limits, of the walk in the snow when Santa finally listened. Those parts of the tale were not as flashy. No storm clouds parted on cue, no songs had been written about them, at least not yet, but they held a quiet power. They taught that even legends could say this is too much and be heard. By the time the next major Christmas season approached, the North Pole felt transformed in ways that did not show up neatly on any screen. The maps were still there. The screens still flickered with digital wish lists. The storm system still roamed the globe with their usual disregard for holiday schedules. But the flight roster on the stable wall told a new story. Rudolph's name appeared for the main night, yes, but only in certain segments. Other routes were marked for Vixen, for Comet, for Dasher and Blitzen and the rest. Each take turns at the front. Beneath the schedule, someone had tacked up another piece of paper. It contained a short list, written in bold, unadorned letters. Maximum flight hours per reindeer per night. Minimum rest periods between major runs. Mandatory warm mash after storms. Voluntary but strongly encouraged post-flight storytelling session. Rudolph read it and, just for a moment, felt the urge to laugh. Not because it was silly, but because it was so delightfully specific. Change, it turned out, could be written down as rules. It could also be felt in the steadier breathing of tired workers who finally believed that those rules would be followed. On the last afternoon before the new, redesigned Christmas Eve, Rudolph stood once more at the edge of the compound. The sky was clear, a crisp blue fading toward early darkness. The air tasted like snow waiting politely at the door. He looked back at the North Pole, lights glowing softly, windows reflecting the sky, reindeer moving with a mix of nervousness and excitement that did not tip over into dread. He turned his gaze upward. The stars were just beginning to appear, faint and promising. For the first time in longer than he could easily remember, he felt not just duty, not worry, but something like quiet anticipation. He was still tired. That would probably be true for the rest of his long life. But he was tired in a way that felt natural, not in a way that felt like something was being stolen from him. The night ahead would be hard. It always was. This time, though, he would not be carrying all of it alone. Chapter 10. A Softer Christmas Sky. On the first Christmas Eve under the new rules, the North Pole woke up to a strange sensation. Space. Not the endless black kind between stars, the small, precious kind between tasks. The workshops were still busy. Hammers still rang, conveyor belts still hummed, elves still hurried, but they no longer ran as if chased by panic. There were pauses built into the day, time to sip cocoa that was still warm, time to stretch, time to stare out the new windows at the slow-falling snow. In the stables, the reindeer followed a revised pre-flight schedule that did not feel like a countdown to an unavoidable collapse. They ate, they rested, they were checked over with care, they stretched and shook out their legs. They had half an hour set aside simply for standing together in the yard, feeling the cold air in their lungs and the ground under their hooves. Rudolph used that time to breathe deeply and quietly practice what he had learned over the past seasons. Let others lead. Trust the team. Remember that his worth was not measured in how much unbearable weight he could carry without flinching. Inside the main hall, Santa held a shorter briefing than usual. He spoke plainly about the night ahead. The weather looked moderate, with a few difficult patches but no record storms. The digital wish lists were, as always, impressive in scale. The routes had been planned carefully, with rest and rotation built into them. He acknowledged openly that there would still be mistakes. He followed this with a sentence that made the room go very still. "We will not fix those mistakes by pushing anyone past their limits," he said. The elves nodded, some with visible relief. The reindeer shifted their weight, processing the idea that getting the job done now officially included keeping themselves intact. Rudolph watched from near the back, feeling a small warmth that had nothing to do with his nose. As evening wrapped its blue shawl around the world, the team assembled at the runway. The air was cold and clear, a deep, steady kind, not the sharp, frantic chill of a storm. Stars pricked through the darkening sky. The aurora hovered faintly at the edges, undecided about putting on a full show. The sleigh gleamed softly under lantern light. It was packed, as always, beyond what any sensible engineer would recommend. Magic hummed through its frame, ready to bend distance and soften time just enough to make the impossible merely ridiculous. Rudolph took his place in the harness, but not at the absolute front. Tonight he started one position back, with Vixen leading the first leg. He could feel the curious eyes of elves and younger reindeer on him, a legend stepping back on purpose. It looked almost wrong to them for a heartbeat, like a painting hung slightly off-center. Then the bells rang. The discomfort dissolved in the rising rush of the takeoff. They launched into the sky. The first stretch was Vixen's to guide. She flew with careful precision, nose pointed into the wind, ears flicking as she listened to Santa's soft calls. Rudolph followed closely, offering small course corrections only when needed. The north unrolled beneath them. Frozen sea, scattered icebergs like ghost islands. Then the first hints of inhabited land. Rudolph felt the familiar pull of habit, the urge to surge ahead, to let his nose seize the narrative. He kept it in check. His glow remained at a stable, moderate level, illuminating their path without trying to dominate it. Over Europe they slipped in and out of clouds with practiced ease. Vixen handled a tricky wind shift over mountains with a calm that would have impressed even her younger self. They landed on rooftops dusted with snow. Santa moved with his old efficiency, softened by a new willingness to admit when he needed a brief pause to catch his breath. In Nen Quiet Village, as Santa returned to the sleigh, he paused a moment longer than necessary to watch the stars. Rudolph noticed. The pause did not cost them the night, it gave it texture. The second leg belonged to Comet. They switched leads over a wide stretch of dark ocean, far from city lights. Harness clips jingled softly as they rearranged. Rudolph stepped back another position. Comet moved forward, excitement visible in every muscle. The air over the water was smoother than over land, but the distances were long. Comet settled into a steady rhythm. Rudolph kept an eye on his pace, ready to nudge if needed, but found, with quiet satisfaction, that he did not need to intervene much. They crossed into new time zones like slipping through layers of thin silk. In Asia they navigated dense cities and sprawling suburbs, weaving between tall buildings and open spaces. Santa relied not just on paper lists and screens, but also on the instincts of his leads. When Comet requested a brief extra circle to get his bearings in a particularly confusing patch of lights, Santa agreed without snapping. Somewhere between one crowded metropolis and another, Rudolph realized something. He was not holding his breath. In previous years he had often found himself flying as if chased by failure. Lungs tight, thoughts narrowed to a single desperate chorus, "Do not fall behind." Tonight that chorus had been replaced by a quieter rhythm. Step, pull, breathe, adjust, trust. By the time they reached the final segments of the route, the world below was already beginning to shift toward dawn in scattered places. They were still racing time, but it no longer felt like a personal attack. Rudolph took the lead for the last stretch over the northern regions, partly for tradition and partly for his own heart. He stepped forward at a signal from Santa. The change rippled easily through the harness. The team fell into a formation they had practiced countless times. His nose brightened. Not to blinding levels, not to the painful intensity of that first stormy legend, but to a warm, confident shine. It lit the snow below, tracing the outlines of forests and frozen rivers. It painted the edges of clouds with soft red. The air felt familiar and new all at once. He guided them over small towns where the streets were almost empty, save for the occasional snowplow grumbling along. He skimmed past farmhouse roofs where a single lamp still burned in a kitchen, perhaps left on by a parent who always stayed up too late. He felt the magic settle around them like a cloak. Not the heavy, oppressive kind of obligation, but the lighter, gentler kind of connection. Every so often he caught a glimpse of something that reminded him why they did this. A child's drawing taped to a window showing a lopsided sleigh and a reindeer with a very large red nose. A plate of cookies left on a hearth, one already broken in half as if someone could not quite wait. A dog asleep by a front door, ears flicking in its dreams as the bells passed overhead. His tiredness did not vanish, but it no longer felt like a weight he had to drag silently behind him. It felt like a natural part of hard, meaningful work, shared among many shoulders. They finished the route a little ahead of the adjusted schedule, not dramatically so, just enough that Santa did not feel compelled to squeeze in one extra flyover of a region that had already been covered. As they turned back toward the North Pole, the sky above the horizon began to pale. The first hints of dawn brushed the edges of the world with soft grey. The stars faded, satisfied with their night shift. Rudolph kept his glow at a gentle level. For once he did not feel the urge to fight the coming light. Morning did not feel like a deadline this time. It felt like a natural conclusion. They landed in the yard with the usual flurry of snow and jingle of bells. Elves cheered, their voices carrying a note of surprise. Not because the deliveries were done, that had always happened one way or another, because everyone looked, in a quiet, stunned way, less destroyed than usual. Still tired, yes, legs aching, eyes bleary, but not hollow. Santa climbed from the sleigh and stood for a moment, looking at his team as if seeing them through a new lens. He thanked them, one by one, by name. He had always done that in earlier years, but now the words sounded different. Less like a line at the end of a performance, more like something he actually felt in his bones. Rudolph met his eyes. Between them passed not the frantic relief of simply having survived another impossible night, but something deeper. We changed it, the unspoken thought went. Together. In the stable, after the usual rub-downs and warm mash and checks for hidden injuries, the reindeer did something new. They gathered in the common area near the front, instead of collapsing immediately into their stalls. Santa, still in his coat, joined them. Mrs. Claus appeared with a tray laden with mugs. Elves drifted in, some leaning against the walls, others perching on bales of hay. They began to tell the story of the night, not the official, polished version that might later make it into a song or a special. The real one. Vixen talked about her first turn as lead on a major leg, describing the moment she almost veered too far west, and how she corrected by trusting the faintest outline of a river below. Comet admitted, with sheepish humour, that he had nearly overshot one entire district, and had only caught himself because Rudolph cleared his throat in a very pointed way. Dasher shared a brief moment when they all had laughed mid-flight for no good reason, other than the shape a particular cloud had decided to take. Rudolph told his own parts. He shared the small wins, like an approach over a town where his glow had lined up exactly with the gap between two storm bands. He also shared the moments when his legs had trembled, and he had felt grateful not to be the only wear responsible for keeping the sleigh steady. They did not gloss over the hard bits. There had been a patch of unexpected fog over their region, a gust near a mountain ridge that had reminded them all uncomfortably of another time. A few houses that would need extra attention next year because some last-minute list updates had simply been impossible to honour in full. Santa listened to these admissions without flinching. He did not turn them into self-blame sessions. He treated them as information, as reality, as part of the living history of their work. Mrs. Claus, leaning against a post near the back, watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. This, she thought, was how legends should maintain themselves. Not by pretending everything had always been smooth and perfect, but by telling the whole story. The effort, the mistakes, the adjustments, the care. Later, when elves spread out across the workshops, and the reindeer finally surrendered to sleep, the new chapter of the Rudolph story began to weave itself into North Pole culture. Young reindeer grew up hearing not only about the foggy night when Rudolph saved Christmas, but also about the many years when he worked too much, the season when he dimmed his nose on purpose, the stable meetings, the snow walk, and the first softer Christmas sky. They learned that courage did not mean never saying enough. It meant saying enough and then helping to build something better. Rudolph himself, as seasons continued, slipped into his new role more fully. He still flew sometimes at the front, especially when a patch of weather required his particular skill. He still felt that old thrill at the moment of takeoff, the brief weightless beat before magic gathered under their hooves, but more often now he flew slightly behind, or even stayed on the ground. He became, reluctantly at first and then with growing ease, a mentor. He watched young reindeer on their first training flights, heart pounding in sympathy. He offered practical advice about judging wind and reading city lights. He reminded them to trust their instincts and their teammates more than any glowing screen. When the season allowed, he sat by the fire in the great hall, surrounded by elves and reindeer and the occasional human visitor who had strayed into the story in a special way. He told them the real history. He told of the valley of his youth, where his nose first embarrassed him. He told of Santa's early visits, the charming and slightly chaotic days when the operation was new. He told the fog story, yes, but with its messy details intact. The doubt, the missed chimneys, the aching head afterward. He spoke of the decades when human cities had grown bright and loud, of the shopping centre tours, of standing in back rooms with tired store workers and feeling a deep kinship. He described the age of screens, the charts that seemed to climb endlessly, the meetings that sounded like they belonged in some distant corporate building rather than a magical workshop. He told them about the morning when his nose refused to shine on command, the stable meetings, the elf with the charts, the night in the storm when Santa snapped and the words hurt more than they should have, and then, because a story is not complete without its own turn toward healing, he told them about the walk in the snow, about the talk under the northern lights, when Santa finally listened as much as he spoke, about the new rules pinned to the stable wall, about the first Christmas that ended with everyone tired but not broken. His tone stayed calm and laced with dry humour. He did not paint Santa as a villain or the North Pole as a factory that had lost its soul. He painted them as what they were, a collection of beings trying, sometimes clumsily, to keep up with a changing world while remembering why they cared in the first place. Children in distant places still sang the simple song about his red nose. That was fine. Here, at the heart of the operation, the story had grown deeper. On a later winter night, long after that first redesigned Christmas Eve, Rudolph stood alone outside once more. The snow lay smooth and quiet. The stars shone with a tired, gentle persistence. The aurora traced faint ribbons along the horizon. He lifted his head and breathed in the cold. He felt the familiar pull of gravity, the memory of countless flights, the echo of bells. He also felt, in a way that surprised him, a peaceful kind of stillness. He was still a tired reindeer, but he was tired at the end of days that included rest, respect, and the freedom to say no when needed. Behind him, the workshops glowed warmly. He could hear laughter from the great hall, the murmur of stories being exchanged. Somewhere in the stable, younger reindeer were probably pretending to be him, practicing their best heroic stances and arguing about who got to be the famous red-nosed one in their games. He smiled in his quiet way. Let them have the glamour, he thought. Let them learn, as he had, that the real magic lay not in shining alone, but in sharing the load of the long night. He let his nose glow, not as a beacon for a desperate mission, not as a symbol pressed into service by too many expectations, just as a light, soft, steady, enough to make a small circle of warmth around him in the snow. Above him, the sky did not shout, it did not demand, it simply stretched, vast and indifferent and beautiful, over one reindeer who had finally found a way to be both legendary and at peace.